The winter of 1885 descended upon Willowbrook, Colorado with merciless precision. Snow piled in drifts against weathered storefronts, and the wind carried a bite that turned breath to ghosts. On this particular night, as most townsfolk huddled by their fires, a solitary figure moved through the blinding white, her path illuminated only by a sliver of moonlight breaking through storm clouds. Eleanor Morgan trudged through knee-deep snow, her threadbare coat offering little protection against the brutal cold. In her gloved hands, she clutched something small and precious, a baby bonnet once white, but now yellowed with age, its edges frayed but the delicate embroidery still visible. Her face, gaunt and weathered beyond her 33 years, bore the hollow expression of someone who had made peace with pain, who carried it like an old companion rather than an enemy. The small cemetery at the edge of town appeared before her, iron gates partially buried in snow. Eleanor pushed through, leaving a solitary trail of footprints behind her. She moved with purpose, navigating between crooked headstones until she reached a spot in the far corner, a small unmarked grave with nothing but a crude wooden cross to signify its importance. She knelt in the snow, unconcerned with the cold seeping through her skirts, and gently placed the bonnet atop the frozen ground. 5 years now, my love, she whispered, her voice carried away by the wind. 5 winters without you. Her fingers traced the invisible name only she could see. A tear froze on her cheek before it could fall, crystallizing her grief in the moonlight. I still dream of your face, the face I never saw. The sudden flare of lantern light behind her came as a shock, illuminating the cemetery in harsh yellow circles. Eleanor turned momentarily blinded to find herself surrounded by a half-dozen townsfolk, their faces set in grim determination. There she is, growled Hiram Fletcher the blacksmith, witching at the dead of night just as I said. Please, Eleanor whispered, rising slowly. I'm only visiting. Visiting what? Demanded Martha Jenkins, clutching her shawl tight around her shoulders. There's no marked grave here, only the potter's field for the unnamed and unwanted. She's conjuring spirits, said another voice, bringing curses down on decent folk. Eleanor backed away, but they advanced lanterns held high like weapons. The bonnet fell from the grave into the snow. That's her witching charm, said Hiram, pointing. 5 years of crop failures and sickness. 5 years of her sneaking out here to cast her spells. No, Eleanor protested, reaching for the bonnet, but rough hands seized her arms. The Baron bring nothing but misfortune, muttered Martha. Everyone knows that. They dragged her through the snow, her feet barely touching ground, back toward the sleeping town. Eleanor didn't struggle. Experience had taught her that resistance only fueled their cruelty. Instead, she focused on the bonnet growing smaller in the distance, now half buried in drifting snow. The town square was deserted save for a few late-night stragglers peering curiously from the saloon. Eleanor's captors hauled her toward the sheriff's office, determined to see her locked away until morning when the preacher could decide what was to be done with her. She's been cursing this town since Benjamin Reed cast her out, declared Hiram to the gathering crowd. Sneaking to the graveyard, planting her charms, poisoning our wells with her barrenness. Eleanor kept her eyes downcast. Benjamin's name still cut like a blade even after all these years. Once she had been Mrs. Reed, wife of the wealthiest merchant in 3 counties. Now she was just the witch woman the barren widow the bad omen mothers warned their children about. As they approached the sheriff's office, a small commotion erupted from the direction of the general store. The crowd paused, turning to see 2 small figures darting through the snow. Stop! Cried a high, clear voice. 2 girls no more than 7 years old pushed through the crowd. Though clearly twins, they weren't identical. One had a noticeable gap between her front teeth, while the other clutched a cloth doll protectively to her chest. Both wore matching woolen caps pulled low over the identical copper-colored braids. Let her go, demanded the gap-toothed one, her small face fierce with determination. She's not a witch. She's just sad, Clara, warned Martha Jenkins. Take your sister and get back inside this instant. No, the girl Clara planted her feet firmly in the snow. She's not doing magic. She's remembering her baby. A hush fell over the crowd. Eleanor's heart seized in her chest. How would you know such a thing, child? Asked the sheriff, who had emerged from his office at the commotion. The second twin, Alice, spoke up, her voice softer than her sister's, but no less certain. We saw her at the store. She was looking at baby things and crying. She mends our clothes sometimes, Clara added. She told us stories about her mama's garden. Witches don't have mamas or gardens. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Children's logic had a way of cutting through adult prejudice, leaving it exposed for what it was. "That's enough now," said a deep voice from behind the girls. The crowd parted as Daniel Hayes stepped forward, his imposing figure silhouetted against the light from the general store. Even with one sleeve of his heavy coat pinned neatly at the shoulder, where his left arm should have been, he commanded respect. The former Army surgeon rarely involved himself in town matters, preferring the solitude of his cabin at the edge of Willowbrook, where he raised his twin nieces away from prying eyes and wagging tongues. "Uncle Daniel," Clara turned to him, relief evident in her voice. "They're being mean to Miss Eleanor again." Daniel's gaze swept over the scene. Eleanor held firmly between two men, her face pale and resigned, the crowd uncertain now that their righteousness had been challenged by children's innocence. "Mrs. Morgan was visiting her child's grave," he said simply. "There's no law against grieving." "There's no child buried there," Hiram protested, though with less conviction. "It's just an empty plot in the potter's field." "Because her husband refused to acknowledge the baby." Daniel replied, his voice level but carrying an edge that made the blacksmith step back. "But a mother knows where her child rests, marked grave or not." Eleanor stared at him, wondering how he could possibly know what she had told no one. "She goes there on the anniversary," he continued. 5 years tonight, if I'm not mistaken." The hands holding Eleanor loosened their grip. "The girls are right," Daniel said, looking directly at her now. "You're not doing anyone harm." He stepped forward and extended his right hand not to the men restraining her, but to Eleanor herself. "You're cold. Come inside." It wasn't a request, but neither was it a command. It was simply an acknowledgement that she was a human being deserving of warmth. Eleanor hesitated, then placed her trembling hand in his. The crowd parted reluctantly as Daniel led her toward the general store, the twins following close behind. "My bonnet," she whispered, glancing back toward the distant cemetery. "I'll fetch it for you tomorrow," he promised. "The storm's getting worse." As if to confirm his words, the wind howled with renewed fury, driving the curious townsfolk back to their homes and erasing their footprints in the snow. Inside the general store, warmth enveloped Eleanor like an embrace. A pot-bellied stove radiated heat from the center of the room, surrounded by barrels of flour and shelves stocked with supplies. The proprietor, Mr. Wilson, eyed her warily but said nothing as Daniel guided her to a chair near the stove. "Some hot tea, if you please, Mr. Wilson," Daniel said, his tone making it clear this wasn't a request either. Clara and Alice hovered nearby, watching Eleanor with undisguised curiosity. "Your teeth are chattering," Clara observed. "Here, have my scarf." Before Eleanor could protest, the child had unwound her woolen scarf and was carefully wrapping it around Eleanor's neck. "Thank you." Eleanor managed the simple kindness, nearly undoing her composure. "We're going home now," Daniel announced as Mr. Wilson reluctantly handed Eleanor a steaming mug. "It's too dangerous for Mrs. Morgan to return to her cottage in this storm." "Home," Eleanor echoed, confusion evident in her voice. "Our cabin," Alice explained, hugging her doll. "It's not far." "I couldn't possibly," Eleanor began. "You can and you will," Daniel interrupted firmly, "unless you prefer the sheriff's hospitality tonight." The thought of a jail cell decided the matter. Eleanor nodded her acquiescence, sipping the hot tea gratefully. 20 minutes later, they were making their way through the blizzard, Daniel breaking trail, while the twins flanked Eleanor, their small bodies leaning into the wind. The journey seemed endless, but eventually a light appeared in the distance, a lantern burning in a window, a beacon in the storm. Daniel's cabin was larger than Eleanor had expected, set back from the main road and sheltered by a stand of pines. Smoke curled from the chimney, promising warmth inside. As they stamped snow from their boots on the porch, Eleanor noticed the craftsmanship of the place. Solid logs carefully fitted a roof that didn't sag, windows that had been recently repaired. Not the rough bachelor quarters she had imagined, but a proper home. Inside, the main room was dominated by a large stone fireplace where a fire crackled welcomingly. A sturdy table with 4 chairs occupied one corner, while a kitchen area with a cast iron stove filled another. 2 doors led off the main room, presumably to bedrooms. Everything was immaculately clean and organized, with none of the disorder one might expect in a household run by a one-armed man and 2 young girls. "Make yourself comfortable," Daniel said, shrugging out of his coat and hanging it on a peg by the door. In the light of the cabin, Eleanor could see him properly for the first time, tall and broad-shouldered, with a face that might once have been handsome before war, and worry had carved permanent lines around his eyes and mouth. His dark hair was streaked with silver at the temples, though he couldn't have been much older than her own 33 years. "Girls, get ready for bed," he instructed. "It's well past your bedtime." "But Uncle Daniel," Clara protested, "we want to make sure Miss Eleanor is okay." "I'm fine, truly," Eleanor assured them, touched by their concern. "You've both been very brave and kind." This seemed to satisfy them. After quick hugs for their uncle, and to Eleanor's surprise for her as well, they disappeared through one of the doors, their excited whispers carrying back into the main room. "They're good children," Eleanor said softly when they were alone. Daniel nodded, stoking the fire. "They see more than most adults give them credit for." An awkward silence fell between them. Eleanor remained standing, unsure of her place in this unfamiliar domestic scene. "You should hang your coat to dry," Daniel finally said, nodding toward a rack near the fire. "And there are dry clothes in the chest by the window. They belong to my sister. They might be a bit large, but they're clean and warm." Eleanor hesitated. "Your sister, Rose." Something in his voice closed like a door. "The girl's mother, she's been gone 5 years now." The same length of time as her own loss, Eleanor realized with a start. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it. Daniel nodded once, his expression unreadable. "The second bedroom is yours for tonight. I'll take the chair." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will, Tio," he repeated, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I've slept in worse places." Too exhausted to argue, Eleanor retrieved the offered clothes, a simple flannel nightgown and woolen robe, and retreated to the indicated bedroom. It was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed covered in a patchwork quilt and a small dresser with a pitcher and basin. A book lay open on the bedside table, its pages marked with the pressed flower. Eleanor changed quickly, grateful for the dry, warm fabric against her skin. The nightgown was indeed too large, but blessedly clean and soft. As she was folding her damp clothes, she noticed a shelf of books against one wall, not novels or poetry, but medical texts with imposing titles. Surgical practices in field conditions, obstetrical complications and interventions, advances in women's medicine. Her fingers traced the spines, curiosity piqued. She knew Daniel had been an army surgeon during the war, but these books spoke of a continuing interest in medicine, particularly in women's health. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called hastily, stepping away from the bookshelf. Daniel entered, carrying a steaming mug. "Chamomile tea," he explained, setting it on the bedside table. "It might help you sleep." "Thank you." Eleanor hesitated, then gestured to the books. "You still study medicine?" It wasn't a question, but Daniel answered it anyway. "When I can. Medical knowledge advances quickly. I try to keep up." "Even though you no longer practice," a shadow crossed his face, "I still have some patients. People who can't afford the town doctor's fees, or who," he paused, searching for the right words, "who prefer discretion." Eleanor understood immediately. The women the town calls fallen, the men with shameful diseases, the children born on the wrong side of the blanket. Daniel looked at her with new respect. "Yes. My grandmother was a midwife," Eleanor explained, "before they called her a witch too." Something passed between them, then a recognition of shared understanding that needed no words. "Get some rest, Mrs. Morgan," Daniel said after a moment. "We'll talk more in the morning." He turned to leave, but Eleanor's voice stopped him. "How did you know?" she asked. "About my baby. About the anniversary." Daniel paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the light from the main room. "I was the doctor on duty when they brought you in," he said quietly. 5 years ago tonight, at the county hospital in Denver." Eleanor's breath caught. "You were there." "I couldn't save your child. For that, I'm sorry. But no one at the hospital would even tell me if it was a boy or a girl," Eleanor whispered, old pain rising like floodwater. "Benjamin insisted there was no baby, that I'd imagined the whole pregnancy. He told everyone I was barren cursed." Daniel's hand tightened on the doorframe. "It was a girl," he said softly. "Small but perfectly formed. I made sure she was buried properly, even if it was in an unmarked grave." The revelation struck Eleanor like a physical blow. All these years she had mourned a shadow, a mystery. Now her child had substance, a gender, a reality confirmed by someone else's memory. "Thank you," she managed through tears. "Thank you for remembering her." Daniel nodded once, his own eyes suspiciously bright in the lamplight. Sleep well, Mrs. Morgan. Eleanor, she corrected him. Please. Eleanor, he repeated, then quietly closed the door. Alone, Eleanor sank onto the bed, cradling the mug of tea between her palms. 5 years of solitary grief, and now, in the space of a single evening, 3 people had acknowledged her child's existence. Daniel with his quiet certainty, and 2 small girls who had somehow recognized the shape of her loss. For the first time in years, Eleanor fell asleep without the weight of being the only one who remembered. Morning arrived in gentle increments. First, the pale glow of dawn through frost-covered windows, then the distant crowing of a rooster, followed by the soft padding of small feet and whispered conversations. Eleanor woke disoriented, momentarily confused by the unfamiliar ceiling above her. As memory returned, she sat up slowly, listening to the domestic sounds beyond her door. The clatter of cooking utensils, the crackle of a freshly stoked fire, a child's laughter quickly hushed. She dressed quickly in her own clothes, now dry if somewhat wrinkled, and smoothed her hair as best she could without a proper brush. When she finally ventured into the main room, she found Daniel at the stove, deftly managing a skillet of eggs with his one hand, while the twins set the table with solemn concentration. Good morning, Clara announced brightly, spotting Eleanor first. Uncle Daniel made eggs and flapjacks. He only burns them a little, Alice added with a shy smile. Daniel turned, a hint of color rising in his cheeks. The girls exaggerate. I'm a perfectly adequate cook. Better than Miss Jenkins at the boarding house, Clara declared loyally, her flapjacks bounce. The casual domesticity of the scene made Eleanor's chest tighten. How long had it been since she'd shared a family breakfast? Not since her brief, unhappy marriage to Benjamin, and even then they had rarely eaten together, him preferring the company of his ledgers to his wife. Please sit, Daniel said, gesturing to the table with his spatula. Coffee's hot. Eleanor took a seat, hyper-aware of being an intruder in this established routine. The twins, however, seemed delighted by her presence, bombarding her with questions as they passed plates and poured milk. Do you really live all alone in that little house by the creek? Alice wanted to know. Yes, for nearly 5 years now. Aren't you scared? Clara asked, eyes wide. Sometimes, Eleanor admitted, but it's peaceful too. Uncle Daniel says being alone doesn't have to mean being lonely, Alice said seriously. But sometimes I think he's lonely anyway. Slim? Daniel warned from the stove. Well, you are, the child insisted. You only talk to your books and your patients. Daniel sighed, bringing the skillet to the table and serving eggs with remarkable dexterity for a one-handed man. My nieces seem determined to expose all my shortcomings this morning. Not shortcomings, Clara corrected. Just truths. Out of the mouths of babes, Eleanor murmured, a smile tugging at her lips despite herself. Breakfast passed in surprisingly comfortable conversation. The twins, it seemed, had appointed themselves Eleanor's defenders and were eager to tell her all about their uncle's secret good deeds around town, how he treated the miners' children for free when they were sick, how he had taught Mr. Wilson's son to read when the school teacher had given up on the boy, how he had delivered Mrs. Holloway's baby last winter when the snow was too deep for the town doctor to reach her farm. The girls have active imaginations, Daniel said, clearly uncomfortable with their praise. Uncle Daniel says it's not charity if no one knows you're doing it, Alice confided to Eleanor. That's why it's a secret. A poorly kept one, apparently, Daniel muttered, but Eleanor caught the fondness in his voice. After breakfast, the girls cleared the table while Daniel disappeared into what Eleanor now realized was a small surgery at the back of the cabin. Through the half-open door, she glimpsed shelves of medicine bottles, neatly labeled instruments, and more medical books. He studies every night after we go to bed, Clara explained, following Eleanor's gaze. He says medicine doesn't stand still, so doctors can't either. Even doctors who aren't doctors anymore, Eleanor asked carefully. Clara shrugged. He says he's still a doctor inside, where it counts. Before Eleanor could inquire further, Daniel returned, shrugging into his coat. The storm's passed, he announced. I need to check on the widow Chen. Her cough was worsening yesterday. Can Miss Eleanor stay while you're gone? Alice asked hopefully. She could help us with our sewing. We're making doll clothes, but we keep pricking our fingers. Daniel looked to Eleanor, one eyebrow raised in question. I'd be happy to help if it's no imposition, she said. In truth, the prospect of returning to her cold, empty cottage held little appeal. You're welcome to stay as long as you like, Daniel said, his voice carefully neutral. I've left your bonnet on the dresser. I retrieved it from the cemetery at first light. Eleanor's heart constricted at this unexpected kindness. Thank you. He nodded once, then addressed the twins. Behave for Mrs. Morgan. I'll be back by midday. After he'd gone, the girls eagerly produced their sewing project, tiny garments for Alice's well-loved doll. Eleanor spent a pleasant morning teaching them simple stitches, marveling at their quick minds and quicker fingers. Your uncle has taught you well, she observed as Clara executed a nearly perfect buttonhole. Aunt Rose taught him, Alice explained, and then he taught us after she died. Eleanor's hands stilled on the fabric. Your Aunt Rose was his sister. Clara nodded. Our mama, she died when we were babies. I'm very sorry, Eleanor said softly. Uncle Daniel says everyone has sorrows, Clara replied with the peculiar wisdom of children. It's what we do with them that matters. He says Mama's watching over us. Alice added her small fingers, working a delicate hem. From heaven. Do you think your baby is in heaven too? Clara asked suddenly, looking up at Eleanor with earnest eyes. The direct question caught Eleanor off guard. I hope so. Uncle Daniel says she is, Clara stated confidently. He says all babies go straight to heaven because they're too innocent for anywhere else. Eleanor's vision blurred with sudden tears. Your uncle is very wise. Sometimes, Alice agreed solemnly, but he still burns the flapjacks. The simple observation startled a laugh from Eleanor, breaking the moment's poignancy. The rest of the morning passed in comfortable industry. Eleanor helped the girls finish their sewing, then showed them how to make simple paper dolls from scraps in Daniel's wastebasket. By the time he returned, rosy-cheeked from the cold, they had created an entire paper family complete with elaborate backstories. I see you've been busy, he observed, hanging his coat by the door. Miss Eleanor knows how to make dolls from almost nothing, Clara exclaimed. Just like magic, but not the bad kind. Daniel's expression softened as he surveyed the paper creations spread across his table. Indeed. How is Mrs. Chen? Eleanor asked. Improving, he replied, seeming pleased by her inquiry. Her son has been boiling pine needles for tea, just as I suggested. The vapor helps clear her lungs. My grandmother used pine and wild cherry bark for chest complaints, Eleanor said, with honey to soothe the throat. Daniel looked at her with renewed interest. Your grandmother was a healer, you said. A midwife and herbalist, Eleanor clarified. She taught me what she knew, though I've had little opportunity to use it since. She trailed off, unwilling to mention Benjamin's name. Since your marriage, Daniel finished for her. Eleanor nodded. Benjamin had forbidden her to practice peasant superstitions, as he called her grandmother's remedies, insisting that his wife would not soil her hands with common work. Wild cherry bark contains compounds similar to those in modern cough suppressants, Daniel said thoughtfully. Your grandmother's wisdom aligns with current medical understanding. The observation warmed Eleanor more than it should have. How long had it been since anyone had valued her knowledge? Perhaps you could write down some of her remedies sometime, Daniel suggested, for reference. I'd be happy to. Their eyes met briefly across the table, a moment of connection that Eleanor felt in her chest like the first thaw of spring. The moment was broken by Clara tugging at her sleeve. Will you stay for lunch, Miss Eleanor, please? The eager question reminded Eleanor that she was still essentially a guest in their home despite the morning's camaraderie. I should return to my cottage, she said reluctantly. I've imposed long enough. It's no imposition, Daniel said quickly, then added in a more measured tone. The girls clearly enjoy your company. Please stay, Alice added, her soft voice nonetheless insistent. We're having stew, and Uncle Daniel always makes too much. Faced with their combined persuasion, Eleanor found herself agreeing to stay for lunch, and then somehow for the afternoon as well. The hours passed in a pleasant blur of domestic activities, helping Daniel prepare the simple stew, teaching the girls a cat's cradle game her grandmother had shown her, listening as Daniel read aloud from a book of Norse myths that had the twins spellbound. It was only when the winter sun began to set that Eleanor realized how completely she had forgotten herself, forgotten the stares and whispers that awaited her in town, forgotten the lonely cottage with its perpetually damp corners, forgotten even the anniversary grief that had driven her to the cemetery the night before. I really must go, she said as Daniel lit the lamps against the gathering darkness. Thank you for everything. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. I'll walk you home. There's no need. There's every need, he interrupted firmly. The path will be icy after the storm. The twins insisted on accompanying them, bundled in their warmest clothes and chattering excitedly about the stars emerging in the clear night sky. The walk to Eleanor's cottage took longer than usual, with Daniel carefully guiding her around patches of ice and the girls stopping to examine every interesting shadow and snowdrift. Eleanor's cottage appeared smaller and shabbier than she remembered, its windows dark and uninviting after the warmth of Daniel's cabin. Built originally as a hunting lodge, it had fallen into disrepair before the widow who owned it had agreed to rent it to Eleanor for a pittance, partly out of charity, partly because no one else wanted to live so far from town. It's not much, she said apologetically as Daniel helped her clear the snow from the front steps. It's yours, he replied simply. That counts for something. Inside the cottage was cold and dark, the fire long dead in the small stone hearth. Eleanor busied herself lighting a lamp, while Daniel efficiently rekindled the fire, the girls exploring the single room with undisguised curiosity. You have so many plants, Claire exclaimed, examining the collection of dried herbs hanging from the rafters. For medicine and cooking, Eleanor explained, oddly self-conscious about her modest home. Just like Aunt Rose used to keep, Alice observed, touching a bundle of lavender with gentle fingers. Daniel glanced up from the fireplace, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Rose was fond of herbal remedies as well. She taught Uncle Daniel about plants that help with pain and fever, Clara informed Eleanor, before she got sick. An awkward silence fell, broken only by the crackling of the newly awakened fire. We should head back, Daniel said, finally rising from his crouch by the hearth. It's getting late. The twins protested, but eventually allowed themselves to be bundled toward the door. At the last moment, Clara turned back to Eleanor. Can we visit you again? She asked earnestly. You tell better stories than Miss Jenkins at school. Eleanor's heart tightened at the simple request. If your uncle permits it, I'd like that very much. Daniel nodded, his eyes meeting Eleanor's over the child's head. We'll come again soon. With final waves and good nights, they were gone, leaving Eleanor alone in her cottage that suddenly seemed emptier than before. She moved about her evening routine by rote, hanging her coat, banking the fire, preparing a simple meal from her meager stores. Only when she was settling into bed did she notice something on her pillow, the baby bonnet carefully cleaned and folded, with a sprig of dried rosemary tucked into its folds. Beside it lay a small book bound in worn leather. Eleanor opened it with trembling fingers. Inside, she found page after page of pressed flowers and herbs, each labeled in a neat feminine hand. Echinacea for strengthening the blood, yarrow for stemming bleeding, valerian for calming the nerves and inducing sleep. A loose piece of paper fluttered from between the pages, a note in a different hand, strong and masculine. Rose's Herbal. She would have wanted another healer to have it. D.H. Eleanor clutched the book to her chest, tears blurring her vision. Such a small gift, yet it acknowledged something essential about her. Not the bereaved mother, not the discarded wife, not the suspected witch, but the healer, the woman with knowledge worth preserving. For the first time in 5 years, Eleanor fell asleep, holding something other than grief. Over the next few weeks, a curious routine developed. Daniel and the twins visited Eleanor's cottage every few days, bringing small gifts, a loaf of bread, a jar of preserves, a skein of wool for knitting. In return, Eleanor began teaching the girls about herbs and simple remedies, knowledge they absorbed with impressive enthusiasm. They have a gift for healing, she told Daniel one afternoon as they watched the twins carefully measuring dried chamomile for tea. Like their mother, I suspect. And their father, Daniel added quietly. He was a doctor too in Denver. That's how Rose met him. It was the first time he had mentioned the girl's father, and Eleanor treaded carefully. The girls never speak of him. Daniel's jaw tightened. Thomas died before they were born. Influenza epidemic of 78. I'm sorry, Eleanor said softly. So many losses for one family to bear. Daniel shrugged, his expression closing. Rose moved here afterward to be near me. She was already expecting then, though. We didn't know it would be twins. The conversation shifted to safer topics, but Eleanor found herself increasingly curious about Rose Hayes, the herbalist's sister, the doctor's wife, the mother who never got to see her daughters grow. From the bits and pieces the twins shared, Eleanor pieced together an image of a strong-willed, intelligent woman who had defied convention to marry a doctor of modest means rather than the wealthy rancher her parents had chosen for her. "She sounds remarkable," Eleanor told Daniel one evening as they sat on her cottage porch watching the girls chase fireflies in the early spring twilight. "She was," he agreed, his voice softening with memory, "stubborn as hell, but with a heart as big as Montana." "The girls have her spirit," Eleanor observed, "especially Clara." Daniel's expression changed subtly at the mention of Clara's name, a tightening around the eyes, a slight tension in his shoulders. Eleanor had noticed this reaction before but couldn't fathom its cause. "Clara reminds me of someone else sometimes," he said after a moment, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. Before Eleanor could inquire further, Ellis came running up with a car full of glowing insects, effectively ending the conversation. As spring advanced, melting the last of the snow and bringing the first wildflowers to the mountain meadows, Eleanor found herself drawn more and more into the Hayes family circle. Daniel began consulting her about herbal treatments for his patients, combining her traditional knowledge with his medical training to create remedies that proved remarkably effective. Word spread quietly among the women of Willowbrook. First came Sophia Weaver, an elderly widow with crippling arthritis seeking the willowbark tea she'd heard the Hayes twins talking about. Then Martha Clark, a young woman who hadn't spoken since her husband's death 2 years prior, came for the calming tincture Eleanor had prepared for Daniel's most anxious patients. Most surprising was the arrival of Agnes Thornton, a woman in her 70s whom most of the town dismissed as senile. She appeared at Eleanor's door one misty morning, her white hair wild but her eyes sharp and knowing. "You're the one who remembers," she said without preamble, "the one who keeps the old ways." Eleanor invited her in, sensing something important in the old woman's presence. "I was a nurse," Agnes announced, settling herself by the fire. "Before they said my mind had gone. 40 years at Denver County Hospital." Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. "Denver County, when Emmett, until 880, Agnes replied, "when they put me out to pasture for losing my faculties." Convenient excuse when a woman knows too much. Eleanor carefully poured tea for them both. "What kind of things did you know, Miss Thornton?" The old woman's gaze was piercing. "I knew which babies went where. I kept the records." She leaned forward, lowering her voice though they were alone. "I knew which wealthy men paid to have their inconvenient offspring disappear. I knew which desperate mothers sold their newborns to pay for food and shelter." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you visit a grave with no name," Agnes said simply. "Because you carry the look of a mother whose child was taken, not lost." Eleanor's hands trembled so badly she had to set down her teacup. "My baby died," she whispered. 5 years ago, Dr. Hayes was there." Agnes nodded slowly. "The one-armed surgeon. I remember him. Good man. One of the few who treated every patient with dignity, regardless of their station. He said my daughter was buried properly." Eleanor continued, the words painful even after all this time. "And you believe that's the end of the story?" Agnes asked, her head tilted like a curious bird. Before Eleanor could respond, a knock at the door announced Daniel's arrival for their now regular consultation about patients. Agnes rose immediately, gathering her shawl. "We'll speak again," she promised, as Eleanor showed her to the door. "When the time is right." Daniel watched the old woman depart with a puzzled expression. "Was that Agnes Thornton? I didn't realize she still received visitors." "She came to me," Eleanor explained, unsettled by the encounter. "For a nerve tonic," she said. Daniel's eyebrow rose skeptically. "Agnes Thornton has nerves of steel. Always did, even when she was head nurse at Denver County." "You knew her there?" "Everyone knew Nurse Thornton," Daniel said with a hint of a smile. "She terrorized new doctors and kept the hospital administration in line through sheer force of will." Eleanor hesitated, then asked, "Was she reliable in her work?" Daniel considered the question. "Absolutely. Best record keeper the hospital ever had. She could tell you every patient who'd passed through those doors, their diagnosis, treatment, and outcome." His expression grew thoughtful. "It was a shame when they forced her to retire. Claimed she was becoming confused, but I never saw evidence of it." This confirmation of Agnes's lucidity only deepened Eleanor's unease. What had the old nurse meant about babies being taken, not lost? And why had she sought Eleanor out specifically? Daniel must have noticed her distraction, or he gently touched her arm. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" She forced a smile. "Just tired. The change of seasons always affects me." He didn't look convinced, but didn't press the matter. Instead, he produced a leather-bound journal from his coat pocket. "I've been compiling our joint remedies," he explained, opening the book to reveal pages of neatly documented treatments with both medical terminology and traditional names listed side by side. "I thought you might want to review it." The gesture touched her deeply. Here was her knowledge preserved and validated alongside modern medicine, given equal weight and importance. "It's wonderful," she said sincerely, paging through the careful entries. "Your sister would be proud." Daniel's expression softened. "I think she would be." Rose always believed that healing came from many sources, not just medical textbooks. As they bent their heads together over the journal discussing adjustments and additions, Eleanor was struck by how naturally they had fallen into this partnership. From strangers thrust together by a snowstorm, they had become, what friends, colleagues? Something still undefined but increasingly precious. The thought warmed her through the rest of their consultation and lingered even after Daniel had departed, promising to bring the twins for a picnic the following day, if weather permitted. That night, Eleanor dreamed of Denver County Hospital, white corridors, and the smell of carbolic acid, a baby crying somewhere she couldn't reach. Agnes Thornton's knowing eyes watching her from shadows. She woke before dawn, unsettled and oddly certain that something important had been just beyond her grasp in the dream. The feeling persisted through her morning routines and was still with her when Daniel arrived with the twins, a basket of food in hand and a spring in his step that she hadn't seen before. "We brought pie," Clara announced, skipping ahead of her uncle. Mrs. Wilson at the store gave it to Uncle Daniel for fixing her son's broken arm. "Uncle Daniel gets paid in food a lot," Alice added seriously. "He says it's better than money because you can't eat coins." Daniel shrugged, looking slightly embarrassed. "My patients offer what they can. I'm not one to refuse good pie." They spread their picnic on a patch of new grass near the stream that ran behind Eleanor's cottage. The day was perfect warm sunshine, a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine, and new growth bird song from the trees above. The twins alternated between eating and exploring, collecting interesting pebbles and early wildflowers to show Eleanor. "They adore you," Daniel observed quietly as they watched the girls attempting to dam the stream with stones. "I've never seen them take to anyone so quickly." Eleanor smiled, watching Clara direct her sister with enthusiastic gestures. "They're remarkable children. You've raised them well." "I've done my best," he said, a hint of uncertainty in his voice, "though I often wonder if Rose would approve of my methods." "What do you mean?" Daniel sighed absently, rubbing his left shoulder where his arm ended. "Rose had grand plans for them. The best schools, music lessons, proper society introductions when the time came. All the advantages she and I never had growing up." He gestured to their surroundings, the rustic cabin visible through the trees, the small mountain town in the distance. "This isn't what she envisioned for her daughters." "But they're happy," Eleanor pointed out, "and loved. Surely that counts for more than social advantages." "I hope so," Daniel said softly. "I promised her I'd give them the best life possible. Sometimes I fear I'm failing her." Eleanor was struck by the weight he carried, not just the physical absence of his arm, but the responsibility of honoring his sister's memory while raising her children alone. "From what I've gathered about Rose," she said carefully, "I think she valued love and character above social position. Otherwise, she wouldn't have chosen to marry a doctor of modest means rather than the wealthy rancher her parents preferred." Daniel looked at her in surprise. "The girls told you about Thomas." "Bits and pieces," Eleanor admitted. "They're proud that both their parents were healers." A shadow crossed Daniel's face. "Yes, well, Thomas was a good man, a dedicated physician." There was something in his tone that suggested more to the story, but Eleanor didn't pry. Everyone had parts of their past they preferred to keep private. She certainly did. As if summoned by her thoughts, a figure appeared on the path leading from town. Benjamin Reed, impeccably dressed as always, his hat tilted at the precise angle to shade his eyes without disturbing his carefully groomed hair. Eleanor froze, her happiness evaporating like morning dew. It had been months since she'd last encountered her former husband, and never here at her sanctuary. Daniel noticed her distress immediately. "Eleanor, what's wrong?" "Benjamin," she whispered, nodding toward the approaching figure. Daniel's expression hardened as he followed her gaze. "Reed, what business does he have here?" "None," Eleanor said, her voice steadier than she felt. "We've had no contact since the divorce 5 years ago." Daniel rose to his feet, positioning himself slightly in front of Eleanor in a gesture that was both protective and proprietary. Benjamin reached them with a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "Mrs. Reed, what a pleasant surprise." "It's Mrs. Morgan now," Eleanor corrected quietly, "as you well know." Benjamin waved a dismissive hand. "A legal technicality. Once wed in the eyes of God, always wed. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Hayes?" Daniel's jaw tightened visibly. "I believe Mrs. Morgan has made her preference clear." Benjamin's gaze shifted between them, calculating and cold despite his continued smile. "I see you found a protector, Eleanor. How convenient for you both." "Mr. Reed," Daniel said, his voice dangerously quiet, "state your business or move along. You're interrupting our picnic." Benjamin raised an eyebrow. "Such hostility, Doctor. I'm merely paying a social call on my former wife." He turned his attention back to Eleanor. "I've been meaning to speak with you, my dear, about a matter of mutual interest." Before Eleanor could respond, Clara and Alice came running up from the stream, their skirts damp and their faces flushed with excitement. "Miss Eleanor, we found a frog," Clara announced, then stopped short at the sight of the stranger. "Who are you?" Benjamin regarded the child with obvious distaste. "I don't believe I'm acquainted with your wards, Dr. Hayes." "My nieces," Daniel corrected firmly. "Clara and Alice Hayes." Clara stared up at Benjamin with undisguised suspicion. "Are you Miss Eleanor's friend?" "An old acquaintance," Benjamin replied smoothly. "You don't seem very nice," Clara observed bluntly. "Miss Eleanor got all quiet when you came." Alice moved closer to Eleanor, taking her hand protectively. "If you're making her sad, you should go away." Benjamin's smile tightened. "Children should be seen and not heard, little girl." "My name is Clara, not little girl," she retorted, her chin lifting in a gesture that struck Eleanor as oddly familiar. "Clara," Daniel warned gently, "take your sister and gather our things. We should be heading back." The twins reluctantly obeyed, though Clara cast several backward glances at Benjamin as they collected the picnic items. "Spirited children," Benjamin observed coldly. "One might even say ill-mannered." "They're perceptive," Eleanor found the courage to say, "a valuable quality." Benjamin's attention returned to her, his gaze sharpening. "Indeed. Well, I won't intrude further on your domestic scene." He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. "I'll call on you properly tomorrow, Eleanor. We have matters to discuss." "I have nothing to say to you," Eleanor replied, hating the tremor in her voice. "Oh, but I think you'll want to hear what I have to say," Benjamin countered, his smile now holding a hint of threat. "It concerns our shared past and possibly your future." With that cryptic statement, he nodded to Daniel and departed, his steps unhurried, as if he owned the very ground beneath his feet. Eleanor watched him go, a cold dread settling in her stomach. Benjamin never did anything without purpose, and his sudden reappearance in her life could only mean trouble. "Are you all right?" Daniel asked quietly, his hand warm on her shoulder. Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. "You don't have to see him tomorrow," Daniel continued. "I could be here when he calls." The offer touched her, but Eleanor shook her head. "This is my battle, Daniel. I've avoided it for 5 years, but perhaps it's time to face it." He studied her face, concern evident in his eyes. "You don't have to face it alone." "I know," she said softly, and realized that for the first time in years it was true. She wasn't alone anymore. The twins returned with the picnic basket, their young faces solemn. "Was that man really your friend before?" Alice asked. Eleanor hesitated, unsure how to explain divorce to children. "He was my husband a long time ago." Clara's eyes widened. "But he wasn't nice to you." "No," Eleanor admitted. "He wasn't." "Then why did you marry him?" Clara persisted. "Sometimes people aren't what they seem at first." Daniel interjected gently. "We learn the truth about them later." Clara considered this, then nodded decisively. "Well, I don't like him, and I don't think you should talk to him tomorrow." "I appreciate your concern," Eleanor said, touched by the child's protectiveness. "But sometimes adults have to talk to people they don't like to resolve old problems." "Like medicine," Alice suggested. "It tastes bad, but makes you better." Eleanor smiled at the apt comparison. "Exactly like medicine." As they walked back to Eleanor's cottage, Clara slipped her small hand into Eleanor's, a gesture of solidarity that nearly undid her composure. On her other side, Daniel walked close enough that their shoulders occasionally brushed his solid presence, a reminder that whatever Benjamin wanted, She now had people who cared about her welfare. At the cottage door, Daniel hesitated. "If you change your mind about tomorrow—" "I'll send word," Eleanor promised, "but I'll be fine." He didn't look convinced but nodded reluctantly. "We'll come by in the afternoon then, after he's gone." "I'd like that." The twins hugged her fiercely before departing, Clara whispering in her ear, "If he's mean to you, Uncle Daniel will punch him with his one arm. He's very strong." The image of proper reserved Daniel Hayes punching Benjamin Reed was so incongruous that Eleanor had to stifle a laugh. "I'm sure that won't be necessary, but thank you." As she watched them walk away, Daniel, tall and straight-backed, a twin on either side, chattering animatedly, Eleanor felt a curious mixture of dread and determination. Whatever Benjamin wanted, she was no longer the frightened, isolated woman he had discarded 5 years ago. She had friends now. She had purpose. And perhaps most importantly, she had begun to reclaim the parts of herself that Benjamin had tried to erase: the healer, the nurturer, the woman capable of both giving and receiving affection. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring, but for the first time in years, Eleanor faced the future with something that felt remarkably like hope. The night passed with excruciating slowness. Eleanor paced her small cottage until the floorboards seemed to memorize her footsteps, pausing occasionally to peer through frost-rimmed windows at the star-strewn sky. Sleep, when it finally came, brought fragmented dreams. Benjamin's cold smile, Miss Thornton's knowing eyes, a baby's cry, echoing down endless hospital corridors. She woke before dawn, exhausted but alert, her mind racing with questions and half-formed suspicions. What could Benjamin possibly want after 5 years of silence? Why now, when she had finally begun to build something resembling a life? Eleanor moved through her morning routine with mechanical precision, stoking the fire and brewing tea, tidying the already immaculate cottage. She chose her plainest dress, a high-necked gray wool that Benjamin had always hated for its lack of femininity. A small defiance, but it steadied her nonetheless. At precisely 10 o'clock, the sound of horses' hooves announced Benjamin's arrival. He had always prided himself on punctuality, one of the few virtues they had shared during their brief marriage. Eleanor watched through the window as he dismounted from a sleek chestnut gelding, taking his time to secure the reins and brush invisible dust from his impeccable coat. Every movement calculated, every gesture designed to remind the world of his wealth and consequence. She opened the door before he could knock, denying him even that small power. "Benjamin," she greeted him, her voice carefully neutral. He removed his hat with a flourish. "Eleanor, you're looking—" He paused, his gaze traveling from her severe hairstyle to her plain dress. "Rustic." "Please come in," she said, ignoring the barb. "I assume you prefer to discuss whatever brings you here in private." Benjamin stepped inside, surveying her modest home with poorly disguised disdain. "Charming. Like something from a fairy tale, the part before the prince arrives." Eleanor gestured to one of the two chairs by the fire. "Please sit. Would you like tea?" "No, thank you," he replied, seating himself with the air of a king granting an audience. "I won't be staying long." Eleanor took the opposite chair, folding her hands in her lap to disguise their slight tremor. "What do you want, Benjamin?" He smiled, the expression not reaching his cold blue eyes. "Direct as ever. One of your less appealing traits, but useful for business matters." "Is this a business matter?" Eleanor asked, her pulse quickening. "In a manner of speaking." Benjamin leaned back, regarding her with calculated intensity. "I'm getting married again." The announcement shouldn't have surprised her, yet somehow it did. Not from jealousy, any romantic feelings for Benjamin had died long before their divorce, but from the simple shock of realizing he had moved on while she had remained frozen in the aftermath of their shared tragedy. "Congratulations," she managed. "I hope you'll be very happy." "Lillian Hargrove," Benjamin continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Perhaps you know the family. Her father owns the largest cattle operation in the territory." Eleanor shook her head. "I'm not acquainted with many of the prominent families these days." "No, I suppose not." His smile turned condescending. "In any case, it's an advantageous match. Lillian is young, beautiful, well-connected, and fertile." The deliberate cruelty of his last words struck Eleanor like a physical blow. She forced herself to maintain her composure, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her pain. "I'm happy for you both," she repeated, "but I fail to see why this concerns me." Benjamin straightened in his chair, his demeanor shifting from casual cruelty to businesslike efficiency. It concerns you because I need our past properly buried before I begin my future with Lillian. Our past is buried, Eleanor said carefully. The divorce was finalized 5 years ago. I've made no claims on you or your property. Not all of our past, Benjamin countered, his voice hardening. There's still the matter of your delusions. Eleanor stiffened. Delusions? Your persistent fantasy about a child, Benjamin clarified with exaggerated patience. Your annual pilgrimages to an empty grave. Your insistence, despite medical evidence, to the contrary that you were once with child. Anger flared in Eleanor's chest, hot and clarifying. Our daughter was real, Benjamin. Dr. Hayes confirmed it. He was there at the hospital when she was born. Benjamin waved a dismissive hand. Hayes is hardly a reliable witness, a disgraced surgeon with one arm and a questionable reputation. What do you want from me? Eleanor demanded, abandoning any pretense of courtesy. A statement, Benjamin replied simply. Signed and witnessed, acknowledging that you suffered from hysteria and delusions following our marriage, that there was no child, that your barrenness drove you to fabricate a pregnancy and subsequent loss. Eleanor stared at him in disbelief. You want me to deny my own child's existence to call myself insane? Why would I ever agree to such a thing? Because I'm prepared to compensate you quite generously, Benjamin said, reaching into his coat to withdraw an envelope. This document transfers the deed to your cottage and 5 acres surrounding it into your name, along with a modest annual stipend for the rest of your life. He placed the envelope on the small table between them. You'll never have to worry about shelter or basic necessities again, all for simply acknowledging the truth. It's not the truth, Eleanor whispered, her voice shaking with rage and grief. You know it's not. Benjamin's expression hardened. What I know is that 5 years ago you suffered a female hysteria that manifested as a phantom pregnancy. The doctors confirmed it. I have their statements. Which doctors? Eleanor challenged. The ones you paid, the ones who never examined me because Dr. Hayes was there, Benjamin. He delivered our daughter. He saw her. Hayes, Benjamin repeated with contempt. Yes, let's discuss your new protector, shall we? A man who lost his medical license after his own sister died under his care. A man who now lives as a recluse with 2 children of questionable parentage. Is that really the character witness you want to stake your reputation on? Eleanor frowned. What do you mean, questionable parentage? A satisfied smile spread across Benjamin's face. You don't know? How interesting. Your sainted doctor. Hayes hasn't shared the true circumstances of his niece's birth. They're his sister's children, Eleanor said firmly, born after her husband's death. Is that what he told you? Benjamin leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. Did he mention that his sister was already dying when she discovered she was with child? That Hayes performed an experimental surgery to save her against the explicit advice of the hospital board, that she died on his table, leaving him with not 1 motherless infant, but 2. Eleanor shook her head, unwilling to believe Benjamin's insinuations. You're lying. Daniel would have told me. Would he? Yes? Benjamin's smile was predatory now. Or did he fear you would judge him as harshly as his peers did? The medical board stripped him of his license, called his actions reckless endangerment of a patient's life. He fled to Willowbrook in disgrace, a failure who couldn't save his own sister. Eleanor stood abruptly, no longer able to contain her anger. Get out! Benjamin remained seated, unfazed by her outburst. I'm only telling you this for your own protection, Eleanor. You're aligning yourself with a man whose reputation is as damaged as your own. Together, you make a perfect target for the town's suspicions. Get out, Eleanor repeated, moving to the door and throwing it open. I will never sign your statement. I will never deny my child. And I will never again allow you to make me doubt my own mind or heart. Benjamin rose with deliberate slowness, retrieving the envelope from the table. I'll leave this with you nonetheless. Consider it carefully over the next few days. He paused at the doorway, his expression cold. If you refuse my generous offer, Eleanor, I'll have no choice but to protect my reputation through other means. Is that a threat? Eleanor asked, her voice steadier than she felt. A promise, Benjamin corrected smoothly. Lillian's father is a county judge. Her uncle sits on the territorial council. I would hate to see legal questions raised about your mental fitness Or about Dr. Hayes's right to practice medicine without a license, what our friends. He settled his hat on his head with precision. Think about it. You have 3 days. With that, he departed, leaving Eleanor standing in the doorway, the spring sunshine suddenly cold on her skin. For several minutes, she remained frozen, Benjamin's words echoing in her mind. Could it be true about Daniel? Had he lost his license after Rose's death? It would explain his reluctance to discuss her passing his carefully maintained practice away from the scrutiny of Willowbrook's official doctor. But even if true, did it change anything? Daniel had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. He had acknowledged her child's existence when everyone else had conspired to erase it. He had treated her as a colleague, valued her knowledge, welcomed her into his home and family. The thought of his family of Clara and Alice brought a fresh wave of anxiety. Benjamin's threat extended to them as well. If Daniel were investigated, what would happen to the twins? Eleanor closed the door and moved to her small writing desk. She needed answers, and there was only one person in Willowbrook likely to have them. Agnes Thornton's cottage stood on the opposite side of town from Eleanor's, a neat whitewashed structure with carefully tended garden beds just beginning to show the first shoots of spring plantings. Like Eleanor, Agnes lived alone, her reputation for oddness and occasional prophetic statements, keeping most of the townsfolk at a respectful distance. Eleanor knocked tentatively, half expecting no answer. To her surprise, the door opened and almost immediately revealing Agnes in a crisp apron, her white hair neatly pinned beneath a lace cap. "I've been expecting you," the older woman said matter-of-factly. "Come in. The tea is already steeping." Eleanor followed her inside, struck by the orderliness of the cottage's interior. Unlike the chaotic dwellings of truly addled minds, Agnes's home was immaculate, with books arranged alphabetically on shelves, furniture placed at precise angles, and not a speck of dust visible on any surface. "You have questions," Agnes stated, pouring tea into delicate china cups that seemed at odds with her modest surroundings. "About Hayes, about Reed, about the child." Eleanor accepted the offered tea with slightly shaking hands. "How do you know all this?" Agnes settled herself in a rocking chair by the window, her sharp eyes studying Eleanor over the rim of her cup. "I may be old, but I'm not blind. Reed rode into town yesterday like a conquering hero, making a great show of asking for directions to your cottage. This morning he called on you looking smug as a cat in a creamery. Now you're here with shadows under your eyes and worry written all over your face." Put that way, it seemed less mysterious and more a matter of simple observation. "You were a nurse at Denver County Hospital," Eleanor began. "Head nurse for 27 years, Agnes confirmed with evident pride. "Until they decided I was too old and too observant for their comfort." "Did you know Dr. Hayes when he worked there?" Agnes nodded slowly. "Daniel Hayes, fine surgeon, steady hands, calm under pressure. The war left him with one arm, but twice the determination of most men with two." "And his sister Rose," a shadow crossed Agnes's weathered face. "Poor Rose. Brilliant mind, that one. Could have been a doctor herself if women were permitted such things. Instead, she assisted her husband in his practice, learning medicine by observation and stolen moments with his textbooks." "What happened to her?" Eleanor asked quietly. Agnes set down her teacup with deliberate care. "What did Hayes tell you?" "Very little," Eleanor admitted. "Only that she died shortly after the twins were born. That her husband had died previously of influenza." "Thomas Brewer," Agnes confirmed. "Good doctor. Not as talented as Hayes, but compassionate. He and Rose were devoted to each other." Benjamin Mr. Reed said that Daniel performed an experimental surgery on Rose, that it killed her. Agnes's eyes flashed with sudden anger. "Reed has a viper's tongue and half the moral sense God gave a toad." "So it's not true." The old nurse sighed, her anger fading to weariness. "It's not that simple. Rose was dying already, childbed fever. Nothing to be done in most cases. Hayes attempted a new procedure he'd read about in a European medical journal. It didn't save her, but it didn't kill her either. She was already beyond saving." Relief washed through Eleanor. Not that Rose's death was any less tragic, but the idea that Daniel had caused it through recklessness had felt fundamentally wrong. "And his medical license," she pressed. "Benjamin said it was revoked." "Suspended," Agnes corrected. "Pending review." Hayes didn't wait for the review. He took the twins and left Denver. Can't say I blame him. The hospital board was looking for a scapegoat after 3 wealthy women died of childbed fever that same month. Hayes was an easy target, a one-armed surgeon performing unconventional procedures. Eleanor absorbed this information, trying to reconcile it with the Daniel she knew. Competent, careful, dedicated to healing. "There's more you're not telling me," she said finally, noting the way Agnes avoided her gaze. The old woman sighed again, deeper this time. "It's not my story to tell, child. Some truths need to come from those most affected by them." "Daniel, you mean?" Agnes nodded. "Ask him about the flood, about the night the twins were born, about the hospital evacuation." She leaned forward suddenly, her voice dropping to a whisper, though they were alone. "And ask him about the birthmark." "Birthmark?" Eleanor echoed, confused. "On Clara's shoulder," Agnes said. "A small crescent moon just beneath her right collarbone." A chill ran down Eleanor's spine. "How do you know about that?" Agnes sat back, her expression closing like a book. "As I said, I kept the records. I remembered the children." She rose abruptly, signaling the end of their conversation. "You should speak with Hayes, soon. Reed won't wait long to make his move." Eleanor stood as well, her mind whirling with new questions. "Thank you for seeing me, for telling me what you could." At the door, Agnes placed a gnarled hand on Eleanor's arm. "When you were brought to Denver County 5 years ago, you were barely conscious, hemorrhaging badly. They took your baby before you could see her." Eleanor's breath caught. "Yes. They told Reed the child was stillborn, a girl with a minor deformity, a misshapen tooth bud, nothing more." Agnes's grip tightened, but there was a pulse when they took her away. "I saw it. A flutter, but there." Eleanor stared at the old woman, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that the night your child was born was the same night the South Platte flooded its banks," Agnes replied cryptically. "The same night Denver County Hospital evacuated its maternity ward. The same night Rose Hayes died giving birth to twins during that evacuation." She released Eleanor's arm. "Ask Hayes about the birthmark, and remember, not all who are lost stay lost forever." With that enigmatic statement, Agnes gently closed the door, leaving Eleanor standing on the porch with more questions than answers and a wild, impossible hope fluttering in her chest. Daniel and the twins arrived at Eleanor's cottage that afternoon. As promised, the girls chattering excitedly about a nest of rabbits they'd discovered in the meadow. Eleanor welcomed them with a smile that felt strained even to her, her mind still reeling from her conversation with Agnes. Daniel noticed immediately. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, while the twins explored Eleanor's herb garden, searching for early strawberries. "Did Reed upset you?" "No, yes." Eleanor shook her head, unsure how to begin. "Benjamin wants me to sign a statement denying our child ever existed. He's offering financial security in exchange." Daniel's expression darkened. "That's despicable, even for Reed." "He's remarrying," Eleanor continued. "He wants to bury the past before he starts his new life." "At the expense of your truth," Daniel observed, his voice tight with controlled anger. "What did you tell him?" "That I would never deny my daughter." Eleanor met Daniel's gaze directly. "But he made threats, Daniel. Against me, against you. He knows your medical license was suspended after Rose's death." Daniel stiffened, his face paling slightly. "I see. And how did he come by this information?" "He didn't say." Eleanor hesitated, then added, "I spoke with Agnes Thornton this morning. She confirmed some of what Benjamin said, but not all." "Agnes," Daniel repeated, surprise evident in his voice. "I wasn't aware you were acquainted." "She sought me out a few weeks ago," Eleanor explained. "She remembered you from Denver County. She remembered me too." A tense silence fell between them. In the garden, Clara called out triumphantly, having found a single ripe strawberry, which she and Alice immediately divided with solemn ceremony. "I should have told you," Daniel said finally, "about Rose, about the circumstances of her death." "Yes," Eleanor agreed softly. "You should have." Daniel ran his hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration she had come to recognize. "I didn't want you to think less of me, to see me as others did a failed doctor who couldn't save his own sister." "I would never think that," Eleanor said with quiet conviction. "But I need to know the truth, Daniel. All of it." He studied her face for a long moment, then nodded. "Not here," he said, glancing toward the twins. "Tonight after the girls are asleep. Will you come to the cabin?" Eleanor hesitated, Agnes's cryptic warnings echoing in her mind. "Ask him about the flood. About the birthmark. Yes, she agreed finally. I'll come. The rest of the afternoon passed in a curious state of suspended animation. Eleanor went through the motions of hospitality, serving tea, showing the twins how to press flowers between the pages of heavy books, discussing the progress of their garden, all while acutely aware of the unspoken tension between herself and Daniel. When they finally departed, Daniel lingered a moment longer than necessary, his hand warm on her arm. 8 o'clock, he said. I'll have brandy waiting. I think we'll both need it. Eleanor nodded, unable to articulate the tumult of emotions churning within her. Anxiety, hope, fear, and something else. Something that quickened her pulse whenever Daniel looked at her with those serious gray eyes. Alone again, she paced her cottage, alternately dreading and longing for evening to arrive. What would Daniel tell her? And more importantly, what truths had Agnes hinted at with her talk of floods and birthmarks and children who weren't truly lost? By the time Eleanor set out for Daniel's cabin, dusk had settled over the valley, painting the snow-capped mountains pink and gold against a deepening blue sky. The air was cool but not cold, scented with pine and new growth, the earth awakening after winter's long sleep. The lamps were lit in Daniel's cabin, warm light spilling from the windows in welcome. Eleanor paused at the edge of the clearing, momentarily overwhelmed by how much this place and the people within it had come to mean to her in just a few short months. Before she could knock, the door swung open, revealing Daniel in his shirt sleeves, his customary reserve replaced by an expression of barely contained anxiety. You came, he said, relief evident in his voice. I said I would, Eleanor replied simply. He ushered her inside where a fire crackled in the hearth and 2 glasses of amber liquid waited on the table. The cabin was quiet, the twins presumably already asleep in their room. They were exhausted, Daniel confirmed, following her gaze to the closed bedroom door. All that excitement over one strawberry. The attempt at lightness fell flat, tension still crackling between them like static before a storm. Please sit, Daniel said, gesturing to the chairs by the fire. The brandy helps, I promise. Eleanor seated herself, accepting the offered glass but not drinking. Tell me about Rose, she said quietly. About the night she died. Daniel took a long swallow of his own brandy before speaking. It was chaos, he began, his voice low, to avoid waking the girls. The South Platte had been rising for days, but no one expected the banks to give way so suddenly. The hospital's lower floors began flooding around midnight. We had to evacuate patients to the upper floors and, in some cases, to other facilities entirely. He stared into the fire, his expression distant. Rose was already in labor when the evacuation order came. Her husband Thomas had died 2 months earlier, influenza, as I told you. I was her designated physician against hospital policy, but allowed given the circumstances. The childbed fever, Eleanor prompted gently when he fell silent. Daniel nodded grimly. It developed quickly, too quickly. One moment she was progressing normally, the next she was burning with fever, delirious. We were in a makeshift delivery room on the 3rd floor, equipment, limited conditions, far from ideal. His hand tightened around his glass. The first baby came without complication, Alice. But then Rose's fever spiked. She began hemorrhaging, and we discovered there was a second child. Clara, Eleanor whispered. Yes. Daniel took another drink. Rose was dying. I knew it. She knew it. Save my babies, she kept saying. Promise me, Daniel. His voice broke slightly. I tried an emergency procedure, a modified cesarean approach I'd read about in a German medical journal. It allowed me to deliver Clara safely, but Rose was too far gone. She died minutes later. Eleanor's heart ached for him, for the impossible choice he'd faced to do nothing and lose both sister and child, or to attempt an uncertain procedure that might save one, but not both. You did everything you could, she said softly. Daniel shook his head. The hospital board didn't see it that way. They claimed I acted recklessly, that I should have waited for a more experienced physician. My license was suspended pending review. But you didn't wait for the review, Eleanor guessed. You took the twins and left Denver. I had promised Rose, Daniel said simply. She made me swear I would raise them myself, not send them to her in-laws who had never approved of her marriage to Thomas. I couldn't fulfill that promise if I remained in Denver, fighting a medical board determined to make an example of me. Eleanor considered his story, finding no deception in it, only the pain of a man who had faced an impossible situation and made the best choices he could under dire circumstances. Thank you for telling me, she said. I understand now why you were reluctant to speak of it. Daniel met her gaze, something vulnerable in his eyes. Because there's more, Eleanor. Things I've never told anyone in Willowbrook. Things I've barely acknowledged to myself. Eleanor's pulse quickened. Tell me. Daniel set down his glass and leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his face illuminated by the dancing firelight. The night Rose died, the night of the flood, was chaos beyond description. Patients being moved, records, lost staff running between buildings as the water rose through the streets. Agnes mentioned the evacuation of the maternity ward, Eleanor said carefully. Daniel's head snapped up. What else did she tell you? To ask you about the birthmark, Eleanor replied, watching his reaction closely. On Clara's shoulder. All color drained from Daniel's face. She knows, he whispered. Knows what Eleanor pressed her heart, hammering so loudly she was certain he must hear it. He rose abruptly, pacing the small space before the fire. I should have told you months ago, the moment I realized who you were. But I was afraid you would take her away. Afraid the girls would be separated, afraid I would lose. Daniel, Eleanor interrupted, standing to face him. What are you saying? He stopped, pacing, his expression a mixture of fear and resignation. Clara isn't Rose's daughter, he said finally. At least not biologically. The room seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. Whose daughter is she? Daniel met her gaze directly, his eyes filled with guilty knowledge. During the evacuation, babies were being moved from the nursery to higher floors. In the confusion, a nurse handed me a newborn girl, assuming she was Rose's second twin. I knew immediately she wasn't. This child was several hours old, not minutes. But the nurse was already gone, rushing to move other infants. Eleanor could barely breathe, Agnes's words echoing in her mind. Not all who are lost stay lost forever. The hospital records were in disarray. Daniel continued, the words tumbling out now, as if a dam had broken. Water had damaged the nursery logs. No one could say with certainty which infant belonged where. And Rose had just died, leaving me with what everyone assumed were her twin daughters. The birthmark, Eleanor whispered. A crescent moon beneath the right collarbone. Daniel nodded slowly. I noticed it the first day you helped bathe the girls. You touched it so tenderly but said nothing. I thought perhaps you hadn't seen it clearly. My daughter had the same birthmark, Eleanor said, her voice barely audible. The doctor told Benjamin before they took her away, a distinctive crescent mark like a tiny moon. They stared at each other across the small space, the truth hovering between them like a physical presence. I think, Daniel said carefully, that in the chaos of that night, your daughter didn't die, Eleanor. I think she was mistakenly brought to Rose's room, identified as the second twin, and given into my care. Eleanor swayed on her feet, the room spinning around her. Daniel moved quickly to steady her, guiding her back to the chair. Breathe, he instructed gently. Deep breaths. Clara, Eleanor managed between gasping breaths. Clara is my daughter. I believe so, Daniel confirmed softly. I've suspected since the first time I saw you at the cemetery, but I couldn't be certain until you mentioned the birthmark. All these years, Eleanor whispered, tears flowing freely now. All these years I thought she was dead. I mourned her. I visited an empty grave. I'm so sorry, Daniel said, kneeling beside her chair. I should have told you the moment I suspected. But I was afraid, not just for myself, but for the girls. They've never been separated. They believe they're twins. And I promised Rose I would keep them together, raise them as my own. Eleanor looked toward the closed bedroom door behind which slept the child she had thought lost forever. Her daughter, alive, thriving, loved. Does she know, she asked. Does Clara know she's not Rose's biological child? Daniel shook his head. No, as far as they know, they're sisters, twins born minutes apart. And now, Eleanor asked, her voice stronger, what happens now? Daniel's face was a study in controlled anguish. That's for you to decide. She's your daughter, Eleanor. Legally, morally, you have every right to claim her. The thought sent a thrill of joy through Eleanor, immediately followed by a wave of uncertainty. Clara had known no mother but the memory of Rose, no father but Daniel. She was happy, secure in her identity as Alice's twin, as Daniel's niece. To suddenly separate her from the only family she had ever known. I would never take her from her sister, Eleanor said firmly, or from you. Relief flooded Daniel's features. Thank you, he whispered, But you deserve to be part of her life, her mother in truth, as well as biology. How? Eleanor asked a practical question, grounding her amid the emotional tempest. How do we explain this to them? To the town. Daniel ran a hand through his hair, his expression thoughtful. We don't immediately. We continue as we have been, you a close friend of the family, spending time with both girls. And then perhaps, he hesitated, color rising in his cheeks. Perhaps we could consider a more permanent arrangement. One that would make you part of this family legally, give you rights to Clara without separating her from Alice. Eleanor's breath caught as she realized what he was suggesting. Daniel, are you? Not proposing, he clarified hastily. Not yet, that would be presumptuous, but suggesting the possibility. Something we might consider for the children's sake. For the children. Eleanor repeated softly, a strange disappointment mingling with her emotional turmoil. Daniel met her gaze, something vulnerable and hopeful in his eyes, and perhaps in time for our own sakes as well. Before Eleanor could respond, a small voice came from the bedroom doorway. Uncle Daniel, I had a bad dream. They both turned to see Alice standing there in her nightgown, her hair tousled from sleep, her doll clutched to her chest. Daniel rose immediately, crossing to lift the child into his arms. What was it about, sweetheart? Water, Alice murmured, burying her face against his shoulder. Lots of water, and someone was crying. Daniel's eyes met Eleanor's over the child's head, a shared moment of understanding passing between them. It was just a dream, he soothed, stroking Alice's hair. Look, Miss Eleanor is here. She knows all about keeping bad dreams away. Alice lifted her head, offering Eleanor a sleepy smile. Can you make me dream tea like you did for Clara when she had the nightmare about the wolf? Of course, Eleanor said, grateful for the practical task to anchor her amid the emotional storm. Let me see what herbs your uncle has in the kitchen. As she moved to prepare the simple chamomile and lavender infusion, Eleanor glanced back to see Daniel settling Alice on his lap by the fire, his strong arm cradling her with such natural affection that it made her heart ache. This was a man who had lost almost everything, his sister, his career, his home, yet had built a new life around the children entrusted to his care. And one of those children was her daughter. The thought still seemed impossible, miraculous. Clara was alive. Clara was here sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware that her world was about to change in ways no one could fully predict. Eleanor's hands trembled as she measured dried herbs into a cup. What right did she have to disrupt these children's lives? To insert herself into their family unit that functioned perfectly well without her? Yet what mother could walk away from her child newly found after years of grief? She's asleep again, Daniel said softly, appearing beside her in the kitchen. The fire always soothes her. Eleanor nodded, still focused on preparing the tea. Daniel, I don't know what to do, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Part of me wants to run into that room and hold her, tell her I'm her mother, never let her go. But another part wants to protect her from confusion and pain. Daniel finished for her. I understand, better than you might think. Eleanor looked up at him, struck by the depth of compassion in his eyes. What would you do if you were me? I can't answer that, he said gently. But I can tell you what Rose would say. She would say that love is never wrong, even when it's complicated. That children deserve the truth delivered with kindness, and that families come in all forms, not just those bound by blood or convention. Eleanor considered his words, finding wisdom in them. Rose sounds like she was a remarkable woman. She was, Daniel agreed, a sad smile touching his lips. She would have liked you, I think. You have the same strength, the same commitment to healing. The simple comparison touched Eleanor deeply. Thank you for that. They stood in silence for a moment, the enormity of their shared situations settling around them like a heavy cloak. Benjamin gives me 3 days to sign his statement, Eleanor said finally. After that, he threatens to take legal action, questioning my mental fitness, your right to practice medicine. Daniel's expression hardened. Reed has always used his influence to bully those he considers beneath him. If he discovers Clara is my daughter, Eleanor couldn't finish the thought, the possibilities too terrible to voice. He won't, Daniel said firmly. Not until we're ready. Not until we've decided together how to proceed. Together, the word warmed Eleanor like sunshine after a long winter. Whatever happened next, she would not face it alone. The tea is ready, she said, lifting the cup. Should I take it to Alice? Daniel nodded, something soft and wondering in his gaze as he watched her move toward the bedroom. At the door, Eleanor paused, suddenly nervous about entering the room where both girls slept, one her daughter by blood, one becoming dear to her in other ways. Go on, Daniel encouraged quietly. They trust you already, more than you know. Eleanor took a deep breath and stepped into the dimly lit bedroom. Two small beds occupied opposite walls, each with a handmade quilt in matching patterns of blue and yellow. Alice had returned to her own bed but wasn't yet asleep, her eyes gleaming in the faint light from the hallway. I brought your tea, Eleanor whispered, crossing to sit on the edge of the bed. Thank you, Alice murmured, sitting up to accept the cup. Clara's still asleep. She never has bad dreams. Eleanor's gaze automatically shifted to the other bed, where Clara lay curled on her side, one arm flung above her head, copper hair spread across the pillow. My daughter Eleanor thought the words still miraculous in her mind. My living, breathing child. Miss Eleanor, Alice's voice pulled her attention back. Are you sad? The simple question caught Eleanor off guard. Why do you ask that, sweetheart? Alice shrugged, her small shoulders rising and falling beneath her nightgown. Your eyes look like Uncle Daniel's do sometimes, when he thinks we don't see. Children's perception never ceased to amaze Eleanor. I'm not sad exactly, she answered truthfully. More wondering about things. Grown-up things, Alice asked, sipping her tea. Yes, grown-up things, Eleanor confirmed with a small smile. Alice nodded sagely. Uncle Daniel says grown-ups have to think about hard things so children don't have to. But sometimes I think children could help if grown-ups would just ask. Eleanor studied the child's earnest face, struck by the wisdom in her observation. You might be right about that. Clara and I want you to stay, Alice continued matter-of-factly. Not just for visits, forever. Eleanor's heart constricted. That's a lovely thing to say. It's true, Alice insisted. We told Uncle Daniel, but he said it wasn't that simple. Grown-ups always say that. Despite the emotional tumult of the evening, Eleanor found herself smiling. Grown-ups can be very complicated. Alice agreed, finishing her tea and settling back against her pillow. But love isn't complicated. You either feel it or you don't. From the mouths of babes, Eleanor thought, smoothing Alice's hair away from her forehead. That's very wise. Mama used to say that. Alice murmured, her eyes drifting closed. Uncle Daniel told us. Eleanor sat with her until her breathing deepened into sleep, then gently took the empty cup and rose. At the doorway, she paused for one last look at Clara, her daughter sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm of emotions her existence had unleashed. Good night, my darling, she whispered, words she had imagined speaking to her child countless times over the years, never believing she would actually utter them to living ears. Daniel was waiting in the main room, stoking the fire, his back to her as she emerged from the bedroom. Eleanor took a moment to study him, the broad shoulders, the empty left sleeve pinned neatly at the shoulder, the silver threading through his dark hair. A man who had lost much but refused to be defined by those losses. A man who had raised her daughter with love and care for 5 years, never knowing the truth until it was almost too late. They're both asleep, she said softly. He turned something vulnerable in his expression. Eleanor, a sharp knock at the door interrupted whatever he had been about to say. They exchanged puzzled glances. It was well past 9 o'clock, late for social calls in Willowbrook. Daniel crossed to the door, opening it to reveal Agnes Thornton, her white hair wild around her face, her expression urgent. You need to come, she said without preamble. Both of you. Reed is at the sheriff's office filing formal complaints. Mental instability, practicing medicine without a license, endangering the welfare of children. Eleanor's blood ran cold. He said I had 3 days. He lied, Agnes replied grimly. The judge, his future father-in-law, arrives on tomorrow morning's stage. Reed wants everything settled before the wedding. He's pressing for immediate action. Daniel's face had gone pale beneath his tan. The girls will be safe for tonight, Agnes assured him, but by morning the sheriff will have no choice but to serve the papers. You need to decide now what you're going to do. Eleanor and Daniel looked at each other, the weight of their shared secret pressing down on them like a physical force. We can't run, Daniel said finally, not with the girls, and running would only confirm Reed's accusations. Then we fight, Eleanor said, a steely determination replacing her earlier uncertainty. We tell the truth, all of it. Daniel's expression was conflicted. Eleanor, if we reveal that Clara is your daughter, Reed could claim parental rights. He was still legally your husband when she was born. The possibilities sent a wave of nausea through Eleanor. Benjamin, with his cold eyes and calculating nature, having any claim on her daughter was unthinkable. There must be another way, she said desperately. Agnes, who had been watching their exchange with sharp eyes, stepped fully into the cabin and closed the door behind her. There is, she said, her voice lowered conspiratorially, but you'll need proof beyond my word or yours. You'll need the hospital records. They were damaged in the flood, Daniel reminded her. That's why the babies were mixed up in the first place. A sly smile spread across Agnes's weathered face. Not all of them. I kept a private log births, deaths, special cases, including a note about a baby girl born to Eleanor Reed on March 17, 1880, with a distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark beneath her right collarbone. Hope flared in Eleanor's cheeks. You have this log, Agnes nodded, hidden in my cellar since the day they forced me to retire. Along with other records, the hospital would prefer remain buried wealthy men paying to have inconvenient pregnancies. Disappear. Experimental treatments performed without consent, falsified death certificates. Daniel stared at her in astonishment. Agnes, if you had such evidence, why didn't you come forward years ago? The old nurse's expression hardened. And who would have believed me, a woman past her prime declared mentally unfit by men half her age with half her experience? She shook her head. I was waiting for the right moment, the right cause. I believe I found it. Eleanor exchanged a look with Daniel, a silent communication passing between them. What do we need to do? She asked Agnes. Meet me at the sheriff's office at 9 tomorrow morning, Agnes instructed. Bring the girls. I'll have everything prepared. She fixed Daniel with a stern look. And be ready to face the consequences of the truth, all of it. With that cryptic warning, she departed as suddenly as she had arrived, leaving Eleanor and Daniel standing in the doorway, the night air cool against their faces. What did she mean, all of it? Eleanor asked softly. Daniel shook his head. I'm not sure. Agnes has always known more than she lets on. He closed the door, turning to face Eleanor with a solemn expression. Are you certain about this? Once we tell the truth publicly, there's no going back. Clara and Alice's lives will change forever. Eleanor thought of her daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, unaware of the storm gathering around her. Of Alice, who wanted Eleanor to stay forever. Of Daniel, who had raised both girls with unwavering devotion. I'm certain of only one thing, she said finally, that whatever happens, we face it together, as a family. Daniel's expression softened, something like wonder replacing the worry in his eyes. It's a family, he repeated the words of promise and a prayer. Outside, the wind picked up, bending the tall pines that surrounded the cabin. Inside, two souls who had known too much loss stood facing an uncertain future, bound by a child who belonged to them both. One by blood, one by choice, and by something else, something still unspoken, but growing stronger with each passing day. Eleanor thought of Clara's birthmark, the tiny crescent moon that had led her back to her daughter after 5 years of grief. Perhaps it wasn't just a mark of identification, but a symbol of something larger, the waxing and waning of life's sorrows, the constant possibility of renewal, of beginning again. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, Eleanor knew where she belonged, here in this cabin, with these people who had somehow become the family she had thought forever lost to her. I should go, she said reluctantly. It's late. Daniel shook his head. Stay. Please, the girls will want you here in the morning. He hesitated, then added softly, I want you here. Eleanor knew she should refuse, maintain propriety, consider the town's inevitable gossip. But faced with the prospect of returning to her empty cottage, of spending another night alone with her tumultuous thoughts, she found she couldn't bring herself to leave. I'll sleep in the chair, she said, making one concession to convention. Daniel smiled, relief evident in his expression. I'll get you a blanket. As he moved toward the linen chest, Eleanor glanced again at the bedroom door, behind which slept the child she had mourned for 5 long years. By this time tomorrow, everything would change, for better or worse remained to be seen. But for tonight, it was enough to be here under the same roof, breathing the same air, existing in the same moment as her daughter. For tonight, that small miracle was enough. Dawn broke in streaks of pale gold and rose over the mountains, light spilling through the cabin windows to find Eleanor already awake. She had slept fitfully in Daniel's armchair, dreams fragmenting into images of hospitals and floods, babies crying Benjamin's cold smile. Now she sat with a cup of tea watching the new day arrive with a curious blend of dread and determination. In the small bedroom, the girls still slept, unaware that their world would change irrevocably in the hours to come. Daniel had risen before first light, moving quietly about the cabin, preparing breakfast, checking the woodpile, his movements deliberate and precise, as if routine could somehow hold chaos at bay. "You should eat something," he said softly, placing a plate of eggs and toast on the small table beside her. "It's going to be a long day." Eleanor managed a small smile. "I'm not sure I can." "Try," he encouraged, "for strength if nothing else." She nodded, taking a bite more to please him than from any real appetite. Outside, birds began their morning chorus, the natural world continuing its rhythms indifferent to human concerns. "How do we tell them?" Eleanor asked the question that had kept her awake most of the night. "Clara and Alice, how do we explain this?" Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair, already disheveled from the same gesture repeated throughout his own restless night. "Simply, I think, children understand more than we give them credit for." "But will they understand why we kept it from them? Why you didn't tell Clara the truth from the beginning?" "I didn't know the truth from the beginning," Daniel reminded her gently. "I suspected, yes, but I couldn't be certain until I met you or your reaction to the birthmark." Eleanor set down her fork, appetite gone again. "I'm afraid," she admitted, her voice barely audible, "afraid she'll reject me. Afraid she'll be angry with both of us for keeping this from her." Daniel crossed the room to kneel beside her chair, his face level with hers. "Clara has the biggest heart of anyone I have ever known, child or adult. She took one look at you being dragged through town and decided you belonged with us. That wasn't accident or coincidence, Eleanor. It was recognition at some level deeper than conscious thought." The observation brought tears to Eleanor's eyes. "Do you really believe that?" "I do," he said with quiet certainty. "Just as I believe Alice already thinks of you as family. Just as I—" He hesitated, his gaze dropping briefly before meeting hers again with newfound resolve. "Just as I have come to think of you as essential to my happiness." Eleanor's breath caught at the simple declaration. Before she could respond, a small voice came from the bedroom doorway. "Uncle Daniel, why is Miss Eleanor here so early? Is it a special day?" They turned to see Clara standing there in her nightgown, copper hair tousled from sleep, her curious gaze moving between them. Daniel rose smoothly, a reassuring smile replacing his earlier intensity. "Yes, sweetheart, it is a special day," he said. "Why don't you wake your sister? Then we all need to talk." Clara's eyes widened. "Grown-up talk about serious things." Daniel nodded. "Very grown-up talk about very serious things." The child disappeared back into the bedroom, and Eleanor heard the murmur of excited voices as Clara woke Alice. Daniel returned to Eleanor's side, offering his hand. "Together," he reminded her softly. Eleanor placed her hand in his, drawing strength from his steadiness. "Together." The girls emerged from the bedroom a few minutes later, hastily dressed and buzzing with curiosity. Daniel guided everyone to the table where they sat with an atmosphere of ceremonial importance that even the children seemed to sense, their usual morning chatter subdued. "Clara, Alice," Daniel began, his voice gentle but serious. "Miss Eleanor and I have something very important to tell you. It might seem confusing at first, but I want you to listen carefully and ask questions if you don't understand. Can you do that?" Both girls nodded solemnly, their eyes wide. "Do you remember how I've told you stories about your mother, about Aunt Rose?" Daniel continued. "She died when we were born," Alice said softly, "but she watches over us from heaven." "That's right," Daniel confirmed. "Rose loved you both very much. But there's something I never told you about the night you were born. Something I didn't fully understand myself until recently." Clara leaned forward, her gaze intense. "What is it?" Daniel glanced at Eleanor, a silent request for her to continue. She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "The night you were born," she began, her voice steadier than she expected, "was also the night of a great flood in Denver, the hospital where your mother had to be evacuated. It was very chaotic, with doctors and nurses trying to move patients and babies to safety." Were you there too? Clara asked. Eleanor nodded. I was. I was a patient in the same hospital. The girls exchanged glance, clearly trying to understand the significance of this revelation. During the confusion, Daniel continued, something extraordinary happened. Babies were being moved from the nursery, records were damaged by water, and in all the chaos, he paused, searching for the simplest way to explain. In all the chaos, a baby girl was brought to Rose's room. The nurse thought she was Rose's second baby, your twin, Clara. Clara frowned, her quick mind working to process this information. But she wasn't. No, Eleanor said softly. She was my baby. My daughter, who I thought had died that night. A heavy silence fell over the table as the girls absorbed this statement, their young faces reflecting confusion, disbelief, and the first dawning of understanding. You're saying, Clara began slowly, that I'm not Alice's twin. You are sisters, Daniel assured her quickly, not by birth, but in every way that matters. You've been raised as sisters, loved as sisters. But I'm not Aunt Rose's daughter, Clara pressed her voice small. Eleanor's heart ached at the child's obvious distress. Rose loved you as her own, she said. She held you, named you, made Uncle Daniel promise to raise you alongside Alice. Just like she promised, Alice interjected, reaching for her sister's hand across the table. Uncle Daniel always says Mama made him promise to keep us together forever. Clara stared at their joined hands, then looked up at Eleanor with an expression both lost and searching. So you're my real mother. Eleanor could barely speak past the lump in her throat. Yes, she whispered. I am. Clara's gaze moved from Eleanor to Daniel, then back again. But my father, Daniel and Eleanor exchanged glances silently, debating how much to reveal. Your father and I were married when you were born, Eleanor said carefully, but we separated soon after. Why? Clara demanded, a hint of anger entering her voice. Why didn't you come find me? Why did you let me think I was someone else all this time? The questions hit Eleanor like physical blows. I thought you had died, she explained, tears welling in her eyes. The doctors told me my baby hadn't survived. I visited your empty grave every year on your birthday. The cemetery, Alice said suddenly. That's why you were there the night we found you. You were visiting Clara's grave. Eleanor nodded, wiping away a tear. I never knew, never even suspected until I met you both. Until I saw the birthmark on Clara's shoulder. Clara's hand moved unconsciously to her right collarbone, where the crescent-shaped mark lay hidden beneath her dress. It's how I knew for certain, Eleanor confirmed. My baby, you had that same mark when you were born. Clara fell silent, her young face a battlefield of emotions, confusion, hurt anger, and something else, something questioning and hopeful. So what happens now? Alice asked, her voice trembling slightly. Will Clara go away with Miss Eleanor? No, Clara exclaimed, gripping her sister's hand tighter. I won't leave you, Alice. I won't. Daniel reached across the table to cover both girls' hands with his own. No one is separating you, he said firmly. No matter what happens, you two stay together. I promised your mother, both your mothers, and I intend to keep that promise. The declaration seemed to calm the girls somewhat, though Clara still regarded Eleanor with wary eyes. We need to go into town this morning, Daniel continued, to the sheriff's office. Miss Eleanor and I have to explain all this to some official people to make sure everyone understands the truth. Will we have to talk to the sheriff too? Alice asked anxiously. Perhaps, Daniel acknowledged, but you'll be with us the whole time, and Mrs. Thornton will be there as well. The old lady with the cats. Clara wrinkled her nose. She's scary. Despite the tension, Eleanor found herself smiling. She can seem that way, she agreed, but she's very wise and she wants to help us. Help us how? Clara asked, still clearly struggling to process everything she'd been told. Eleanor exchanged a glance with Daniel, uncertain how much to explain about Benjamin's threats. There's a man in town who doesn't want the truth to be known, Daniel said carefully. Mrs. Thornton has proof that will make him listen. Is it my father? Clara asked suddenly, her gaze sharp on Eleanor's face. The man from yesterday at the picnic, Eleanor's breath caught at the child's perceptiveness. Yes, she admitted. Mr. Reed is your father by law, though he never knew you survived. Clara's expression darkened. I don't like him. He was mean to you. Yes, Eleanor said softly. He was. Then I don't want him to be my father. Clara declared with the simple absolutism of childhood. I'd rather have Uncle Daniel. The statement hung in the air laden with implications that the adults understood, but the children could not yet grasp. Daniel cleared his throat, clearly moved by Clara's words. We should get ready, he said, rising from the table. Mrs. Thornton will be expecting us at 9 o'clock. The practical task of preparing for their journey into town provided a welcome distraction from the emotional intensity of their conversation. Eleanor helped the girls dress in their best clothes, simple but clean cotton dresses with matching blue ribbons for their hair. While Daniel gathered the documents, Agnes had recommended Rose's death certificate, the twins' birth records, his own medical credentials. By the time they set out, the morning had fully bloomed, the spring sun warming the earth and coaxing wildflowers from the meadow grass. Under different circumstances, it would have been a perfect day for a picnic or a nature walk. Instead, they walked toward town with the solemn purpose of pilgrims approaching a shrine, the girls unusually quiet between the adults. Clara had said little since their conversation at breakfast, lost in her own thoughts. Occasionally, she would glance up at Eleanor, her expression a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty, before returning her gaze to the path. Alice, sensing her sister's distress, stayed close beside her, their hands tightly linked. It will be all right, Daniel said quietly to Eleanor as they approached the outskirts of Willowbrook. Whatever happens. Eleanor wished she could share his certainty. Ahead, the town was already buzzing with activity, merchants opening their shops, wagons, delivering goods, ordinary life proceeding, while their own hung in the balance. As they passed the general store, Eleanor became aware of curious glances, whispered conversations that ceased as they drew near. News traveled quickly in small towns, and Benjamin had clearly been busy. Several women gathered on the mercantile porch, watched them pass with undisguised interest, while a group of men outside the barbershop fell silent, their expressions ranging from curiosity to outright hostility. They're all staring, Alice whispered, pressing closer to Daniel's side. Let them, Claire replied with unexpected fierceness. We're not doing anything wrong. The sheriff's office stood at the far end of the main street, a squat brick building with barred windows and a weathered wooden sign. As they approached, Eleanor saw Agnes Thornton already waiting on the porch, ramrod straight, despite her years, a leather satchel clutched in her gnarled hands. You're late, she announced as they reached her, though they were still several minutes early by the town clock. They're already inside Reed, Judge Hargrove, Reverend Wilson, and that pompous fool who calls himself a doctor. Daniel's jaw tightened at the mention of Willowbrook's official physician, a man who had made no secret of his disdain for Daniel's irregular medical practice. Are you ready? Agnes asked, her sharp gaze moving from Daniel to Eleanor. As ready as we'll ever be, Daniel replied. Agnes nodded once, then surprised them all by kneeling with some difficulty to address the twins directly. You two, she said, her voice gentler than Eleanor had ever heard it, are very brave girls. Today will be confusing and probably a bit frightening, but remember you are loved. By many people. That's a rare gift in this world. Both girls stared at her, clearly unused to this softer version of the woman the town considered half mad. Thank you, Mrs. Thornton, Alice said politely. Clara said nothing but gave a small nod, her eyes wide and solemn. Agnes rose with a grunt, her knees protesting the movement. Let's get this over with, she said, her customary brusqueness returning. I have cats to feed. Inside, the sheriff's office was crowded and overwarm, the spring sun beating through the windows to create a stuffy atmosphere that matched the tension in the room. Sheriff Thomas Mason, a man more accustomed to breaking up saloon fights than adjudicating complex legal matters, sat behind his desk, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Beside him stood Benjamin Reed, immaculately dressed as always, his expression a study in righteous indignation. Three other men completed the tableau: Judge Hargrove, a corpulent figure with mutton chop whiskers and the florid complexion of a dedicated drinker. Reverend Wilson, whose perpetual expression of pious concern belied his fondness for gossip. And Dr. Philip Green, a thin, sallow man whose medical knowledge was as limited as his bedside manner. All conversations ceased as Daniel's party entered, 5 pairs of eyes turning to evaluate the newcomers with varying degrees of hostility and curiosity. Dr. Hayes, Sheriff Mason, began, his discomfort evident. Mrs. Morgan, thank you for coming in this morning. Given the nature of the complaints against them, they had little choice. Benjamin interjected smoothly. We've made no formal arrest, the sheriff corrected, clearly annoyed by Benjamin's presumption. This is merely an inquiry at this stage. An inquiry that should be conducted without the presence of children. Judge Hargrove rumbled his gaze, settling disapprovingly on Clara and Alice. Or known mental defectives, he added with a pointed look at Agnes. Agnes snorted. Better a defective mind than no mind at all, Hargrove. The judge purpled, but before he could respond, Daniel stepped forward, his posture straight and commanding, despite his missing arm, every inch the military surgeon he had once been. Sheriff Mason, he said calmly, we understand that Mr. Reed has made certain allegations against Mrs. Morgan and myself. We're here to address those allegations and provide evidence that will, I believe, resolve this matter definitively. Benjamin's smug expression faltered slightly at Daniel's confident tone. The evidence is quite clear, he insisted. Mrs. Morgan, my former wife, has a documented history of mental instability, specifically delusions regarding a non-existent pregnancy and child. Hayes, whose medical license was suspended following the death of his sister, has been practicing medicine illegally in Willowbrook for 5 years, potentially endangering the community. Furthermore, Green added, adjusting his spectacles with an air of professional superiority, there is the matter of the children's welfare. 2 young girls being raised by an unmarried man of questionable professional ethics, with the recent inclusion of a woman known for erratic behavior and suspected witchcraft. Eleanor felt Clara stiffen beside her at these words, the child's hand tightening on hers in silent protest. If I may, Agnes interrupted, stepping forward to place her satchel on the sheriff's desk with a decisive thump. Before these gentlemen continue their character assassination, perhaps we might introduce some actual facts into the proceedings. Miss Thornton, Judge Hargrove began dismissively, your reputation for eccentricity. My reputation, Agnes cut in sharply, includes 47 years as head nurse at Denver County Hospital, during which time I delivered over 2,000 babies, assisted in countless surgeries, and maintained the most comprehensive patient records in the territory. She fixed the judge with a steely gaze. So, unless you've suddenly acquired medical training to match your legal expertise, I suggest you listen before passing judgment. A surprised silence followed this speech. Sheriff Mason cleared his throat. Perhaps we should hear what Mrs. Thornton has to say. Agnes nodded briskly and opened her satchel, withdrawing a leather-bound journal and several official-looking documents yellowed with age. These are my personal records from Denver County Hospital, including notes on all births and deaths during March of 1880, specifically the night of March 17th when the South Platte flooded and the hospital was partially evacuated. She placed the journal on the desk and opened it to a marked page. Here you will find my entry regarding the birth of a female infant to one Eleanor Reed, wife of Benjamin Reed of Denver. The child was born at 11:42 p.m. with a distinctive crescent-shaped birthmark beneath the right collarbone. Benjamin stepped forward, his face flushing with anger. This is absurd. The child was stillborn. The doctor confirmed it. The doctor, Agnes continued implacably, was Dr. James Whitfield, who was also attending 3 other births that night while supervising the evacuation of the maternity ward. He spent less than 2 minutes with Mrs. Reed's child before declaring her stillborn and handing her to a nurse for removal. She looked directly at Benjamin. A nurse who was then diverted to assist with another patient, Rose Hayes, who was hemorrhaging after delivering her first twin. The sheriff frowned, clearly struggling to follow the narrative. Are you suggesting some kind of mistake was made? I'm not suggesting anything, Agnes replied. I'm stating as a matter of documented fact that in the chaos of the flood and evacuation, Eleanor Reed's living infant was mistakenly brought to Rose Hayes' room and identified as the second twin, while a stillborn child from another mother was recorded as Eleanor Reed's baby. A stunned silence fell over the room as the implications of this statement sank in. Benjamin recovered first, his face contorting with fury. This is preposterous, a fabrication designed to support Mrs. Morgan's delusions. It is the truth, Eleanor said, speaking for the first time since entering the room. My daughter didn't die that night. She was accidentally given to Rose Hayes and has been raised for the past 5 years as Clara Hayes. All eyes turned to Clara, who stood straight-backed beside Eleanor, her young face solemn but determined. Impossible, Benjamin scoffed, though a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. Where is your proof? The birthmark, Agnes replied promptly. described in my records, invisible on the child's body. Medical records documenting Rose Hayes' pregnancy, which mention only a single fetus, not twins. And most conclusively, she withdrew another document from her satchel, the hospital's official record of births for that night, which lists baby girl Reed as born at 11:42 p.m. and baby girl Hayes as born at 11:57 p.m., a full 15 minutes later. If such records existed, why weren't they consulted at the time? Judge Hargrove demanded. Because the official registrar's office was on the ground floor, Agnes explained with exaggerated patience. Underwater by midnight. These copies were salvaged days later, by which time Eleanor Reed had been discharged, and Daniel Hayes had already left Denver with what everyone assumed were his twin nieces. Sheriff Mason turned to Daniel. Did you know about this, Hayes? Daniel met his gaze steadily. I suspected it when I first saw Mrs. Morgan at the cemetery last winter. The date she was visiting, March 17th, matched Clara's birthday. When I later noticed that Mrs. Morgan recognized Clara's birthmark, my suspicions grew stronger. But I couldn't be certain until Mrs. Thornton confirmed the hospital records. And you said nothing, Benjamin demanded incredulously. You kept my child from me for 5 years. I kept a child I believed to be my niece safe and loved. Daniel corrected his voice level, despite the obvious effort it cost him. I had no reason to believe she was anyone else's until recently. Besides, Eleanor added, her voice gaining strength, you told everyone our baby had died. You refused to even look at her body or attend her burial. You divorced me weeks later, citing my barrenness as grounds. Benjamin's face reddened. That's beside the point. If this fantasy is true, then the child is legally mine. I demand immediate custody. No, Clara cried, speaking for the first time. She moved closer to Eleanor, gripping her hand tightly. I won't go with you. You're mean, and I don't like you. Clara, Daniel cautioned gently, though his own expression reflected the child's sentiment. Benjamin's face hardened. The opinions of a 5-year-old are hardly relevant to legal proceedings. She's nearly 6, Alice piped up loyally, moving to stand beside her sister. And she's very smart. Sheriff Mason, Agnes interjected before Benjamin could respond. I believe we're overlooking a critical point of law here. According to territorial statutes, a man who publicly repudiates paternity and fails to provide support for a period exceeding 1 year forfeits all parental rights. Judge Hargrove frowned. That law refers to cases of acknowledged illegitimacy, not situations where the father believed the child deceased. Perhaps, Agnes conceded, but the statute makes no such distinction. It states only that public repudiation and failure to provide support constitute abandonment under the law. She fixed Benjamin with a cold stare. Mr. Reed has spent 5 years telling anyone who would listen that his wife was never pregnant, that the child never existed. How much more public could his repudiation be? The judge and sheriff exchanged uncertain glances, clearly out of their depth in this unusual legal territory. There's a simple solution, Reverend Wilson offered, speaking for the first time. The child should be placed with a respectable family until this matter is resolved legally. No, Daniel and Eleanor said simultaneously. Clara stays with us, Daniel continued firmly, with her sister in the only home she's ever known. That arrangement is hardly proper, the Reverend objected. An unmarried man and woman sharing custody of children to whom their relationship is complicated at best. A brief silence followed this observation, broken unexpectedly by Clara. Why don't you just get married, she asked, looking between Daniel and Eleanor with the practical directness of childhood. Then we could all stay together. Alice nodded enthusiastic agreement. We've been saying so for ages. Grown-ups are so slow sometimes. A ripple of surprised laughter broke the tension in the room. Even Sheriff Mason's lips twitched toward a smile. Eleanor felt heat rising in her cheeks as she met Daniel's gaze. His expression held surprise, certainly, but also something warmer, more thoughtful. An excellent suggestion, Agnes declared, snapping her journal closed with an air of finality. Marriage would resolve the propriety concerns, establish legal guardianship for both children, and prevent any further mischief from Mr. Reed. This is absurd, Benjamin sputtered. You can't possibly be taking this far seriously, Sheriff. Judge Hargrove, surely you... The judge held up a hand, silencing Benjamin's protests. While irregular, the evidence presented by Mrs. Thornton appears credible. The birthmark, in particular, provides compelling physical proof of the child's identity. I want to see this supposed birthmark, Benjamin demanded. Absolutely not, Daniel said firmly. Clara is not a specimen to be examined for your satisfaction. I don't mind, Clara said unexpectedly. She turned to the sheriff. It's right here, she added, pulling aside the collar of her dress to reveal a small, perfectly formed crescent shape beneath her right collarbone. The sheriff's eyebrows rose as he looked from the birthmark to Agnes's journal, where a simple sketch showed an identical mark. Well, I'll be damned, he muttered, then quickly amended. Pardon my language, ladies. Benjamin stared at the birthmark, his face draining of color, as the reality of the situation finally seemed to penetrate his denial. This changes nothing legally, he insisted, though with less conviction. The child is still mine by right of marriage. A marriage you dissolved 5 years ago, Agnes reminded him, after publicly declaring there was no child. Perhaps, Sheriff Mason suggested cautiously, we might consider what's best for the child herself. All eyes turned to Clara, who stood between Eleanor and Daniel, her small face solemn but composed. The sheriff addressed her directly with unexpected gentleness. Clara, do you understand what we're discussing here? That Mrs. Morgan is your birth mother and Mr. Reed is your birth father? Clara nodded. But Uncle Daniel raised me, and Alice is my sister. She looked up at Eleanor. And Miss Eleanor is nice. She tells good stories and makes medicine from plants and doesn't mind when we get our dresses dirty. The simple, childish assessment brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. I see, the sheriff said, his weathered face softening. And if you had to choose where to live, what would you want? Clara didn't hesitate. With Uncle Daniel and Miss Eleanor and Alice, all together. The child is clearly confused, Benjamin objected. She's been manipulated. On the contrary, Judge Hargrove said slowly, she seems remarkably clear-headed for her age. He turned to Daniel and Eleanor. The Reverend's concern about propriety is valid, however. The community would not look kindly on an unmarried couple raising children together regardless of the unusual circumstances. Daniel straightened his expression resolute. Then I'll have to remedy that situation. He turned to Eleanor, taking her hand in his. I had planned a more private moment for this, but perhaps now is as good a time as any. Eleanor's heart skipped as she realized what was happening. Around them, the room had gone absolutely still, even Benjamin momentarily silenced by the unexpected turn of events. Eleanor Morgan, Daniel said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife, not just for the children's sake or to satisfy legal concerns, but because these past months with you have shown me what it means to find home in another person's heart? Time seemed to suspend as Eleanor looked into his face, the face of a man who had endured war loss and personal sacrifice without surrendering his essential kindness. A man who had raised her daughter with love and more, who had seen value in her knowledge when others dismissed it, who had defended her dignity when the town would have stripped it away. Yes, she said simply, with all my heart, yes. Alice let out a delighted squeal while Clara beamed with the satisfaction of a child whose obvious suggestion has finally been heeded by slow-witted adults. Well, that's settled then, Sheriff Mason declared, clearly relieved to have an uncomplicated resolution to the complicated situation. Reverend Wilson can perform the ceremony whenever you're ready. Today, Clara suggested eagerly. Right now, not quite so fast. Eleanor laughed, caught between tears and joy. But soon, I promise, Benjamin slammed his fist on the desk, startling everyone. This changes nothing, he insisted, his handsome face ugly with thwarted rage. I'll appeal to the territorial court. You'll what, Reed? Agnes interrupted coldly. Explain to the court how you abandoned a wife recovering from childbirth. How you told everyone who would listen that she was delusional and barren. How you're now engaged to the judge's daughter while attempting to claim a child you've spent 5 years denying existed. She stepped closer to him, her aged frame nonetheless intimidating in its righteousness. Or perhaps you'd like me to share some of my other records with the court, about your visits to certain establishments in Denver, about the money you paid to make another young woman's problem disappear 2 years before you married Eleanor. Benjamin blanched his gaze, darting nervously to Judge Hargrove. These are outrageous slanders. They're documented facts, Agnes corrected. Facts I've kept private until now out of respect for the innocent parties involved, but if you persist in this vindictive crusade, I'll have no choice but to ensure all your secrets see the light of day." A heavy silence followed this threat. Benjamin looked around the room, finding no allies in the assembled faces. Even Judge Hargrove seemed unwilling to meet his gaze. "This isn't over," he said, finally snatching his hat from the desk. "You haven't heard the last of this matter." With that, he stormed from the office, the door slamming behind him with a finality that suggested otherwise. Sheriff Mason exhaled a long breath. "Well, that was certainly the most interesting morning I've had in this office." He looked at Daniel and Eleanor with a mixture of bemusement and respect. "I believe we can consider this inquiry concluded unless Judge Hargrove disagrees." The judge shook his head, already rising from his chair. "I've heard enough. The child's parentage seems clear, as does her preference. Given Dr. Hayes and Mrs. Morgan's intention to marry, I see no reason for further legal intervention." He paused, his expression softening slightly as he regarded the twins. "Though I would recommend formalizing the adoption of both children after the wedding to prevent any future complications." "Thank you, Your Honor," Daniel said sincerely. "We'll do exactly that." As the official party dispersed, Reverend Wilson approached Daniel and Eleanor, his expression thoughtful. "I could perform the ceremony this Sunday after services," he offered, "if that would suit." Eleanor looked at Daniel, who nodded with a smile that warmed her to her toes. "Sunday would be perfect," she agreed. "Thank you, Reverend." Outside, the spring sunshine seemed brighter somehow. The town's suspicious stares less threatening now that the truth had been acknowledged and accepted by those in authority. Agnes walked with them as far as the mercantile, her mission accomplished, her leather satchel once again securely buckled. "I've waited 5 years to use those records," she confided as they paused at the crossroads. "Watching Reed strut around town like an overstuffed peacock, knowing what I knew." A satisfied smile creased her weathered face. Worth every minute of the wait to see his expression when he realized he'd been outmaneuvered. "We can never thank you enough," Eleanor said, impulsively embracing the older woman. Agnes stiffened momentarily, then awkwardly patted Eleanor's back. "Yes, well, I've always believed truth finds its way to the surface eventually. Sometimes it just needs a little help." She disentangled herself from Eleanor's embrace, nodding briskly to Daniel. "You've got yourself a good woman there, Hayes. Try not to be an idiot about it." Daniel's lips twitched with suppressed amusement. "I'll do my best, Nurse Thornton." Agnes's expression softened as she looked down at the twins. "And you two," she said, her voice gentler, "take care of each other. Sisters are precious, whether by blood or by choice." With that, she turned and walked away, her back straight, her step purposeful despite her years. "She's not as scary as I thought," Claire observed, watching Agnes's retreating figure. "Most people aren't once you know their stories," Daniel replied, his hand finding Eleanor's with easy familiarity. They walked home slowly, savoring the spring day and their newfound security. The girls ran ahead, their earlier solemnity forgotten in the relief of resolution, stopping to pick wildflowers or chase butterflies through the meadow grass. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor asked quietly. Her fingers laced through Daniel's. "About marrying me, I mean. It needn't be so soon if you'd prefer time to consider." Daniel stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "Eleanor Morgan, I have been considering this since the day you taught the twins to make paper dolls in your cottage. Since the night you shared your grandmother's remedies with me. Since every moment I've watched you build a place in our lives with such natural grace that it feels as though you've always been there." He touched her cheek gently, his expression open and vulnerable in a way she'd rarely seen. "I'm not marrying you for convenience or for the children's sake or to satisfy the town's sense of propriety. I'm marrying you because somewhere between rescuing you from a snowstorm and watching you rescue me from my own isolation, I fell completely and irrevocably in love with you." Eleanor's breath caught at the simple, heartfelt declaration. "Daniel," she whispered, unable to find words adequate to express the emotions swelling in her chest. He smiled, understanding her silence. "You don't have to wait it back. Not yet. I know this has all happened so quickly." "I love you," she interrupted, the words tumbling out with the force of absolute certainty. "I think I have since the night you told me my daughter was real, that you remembered her. Since you saw me, truly saw me, when everyone else looked through me or away from me." Daniel's smile broadened, transforming his serious face with a joy so radiant it nearly took her breath away. Slowly giving her time to withdraw if she wished, he leaned forward and kissed her, a gentle, brief touch of lips that nonetheless contained a promise of passion, carefully restrained. "You," came a chorus from nearby, breaking the moment with childish disgust. They turned to find the twins watching them from a cluster of aspen trees, their expressions comically revolted despite the flowers clutched in their hands. "Are you going to do that all the time now?" Clara demanded, wrinkling her nose. "Probably," Daniel confirmed, not releasing Eleanor's hand. "It's what people do when they're in love." "Well, it's gross," Alice declared with authority, "but I guess we can get used to it, if we have to." Eleanor laughed, joy bubbling up from some long-sealed place within her. "Very generous of you both." The girls approached, suddenly shy despite their earlier boldness. Clara held out a small bouquet of spring wildflowers, bluebells, lupine, and wild columbine gathered in a haphazard bunch. "These are for you," she said, offering them to Eleanor. Because you're my mother." The words came hesitantly, testing their shape and weight. "If that's okay." Eleanor knelt to accept the flowers, her vision blurring with tears. "It's more than okay," she assured the child. Her child, this miracle she had never dared hope for. "It's the most wonderful thing anyone has ever called me." Clara studied her face with serious eyes so like her own. "Can I still call Uncle Daniel, even though he's going to be your husband?" "You can call me whatever feels right to you," Daniel assured her, kneeling beside Eleanor. "Uncle Daniel, Father Papa, it doesn't matter what name you use. What matters is that we're a family now." "A real family," Alice added, sidling closer to Eleanor. "With a mother and everything." "Yes," Eleanor agreed, opening her arms to include both girls in her embrace. "A real family." Over their heads, her eyes met Daniel's, sharing a moment of perfect understanding of the long road that had led them here, of the challenges still ahead, of the extraordinary gift they had been given in finding each other against all odds. "Shall we go home?" Daniel suggested, helping Eleanor to her feet once the girls had squirmed free of her embrace. Home. The word resonated in Eleanor's heart like a bell, clear and true. Not her lonely cottage or the empty grave she had visited for 5 years, but the cabin beneath the pines where love had slowly blossomed amid shared griefs and quiet joys. "Yes," she said, taking his hand once more. "Let's go home." The wedding took place as planned that Sunday, a simple ceremony in Willowbrook's white-steepled church. The building was unexpectedly full, not just with the usual congregation, but with faces Eleanor had come to know over the past months. Sophia Weaver, the elderly widow whose arthritis Eleanor had eased with willowbark tea. Martha Clark, who had begun speaking again after Eleanor's gentle treatments. Families whose children Daniel had treated when they couldn't afford Dr. Green's fees. Even more surprising were the faces she didn't immediately recognize: miners from the hills above town, farmers from outlying homesteads, travelers who had passed through Willowbrook and received kindness from the one-armed doctor or the herbalist widow. "Word travels," Agnes explained as she helped Eleanor with the simple cream-colored dress they had hastily altered for the occasion. "People remember who helped them when they were suffering." The twins served as flower girls, solemn and proud in matching blue dresses with fresh wildflowers woven into their copper braids. Alice carried a basket of rose petals, while Clara bore a small cushion with the ring's simple gold bands Daniel had commissioned from the blacksmith's son, who had discovered an unexpected talent for fine metalwork. When Eleanor walked down the aisle, her borrowed dress rustling softly with each step, she saw only Daniel waiting for her at the altar, tall and straight, in his good coat, his dark hair neatly combed, his face alight with a joy that matched her own. Reverend Wilson spoke of new beginnings, of families forged through love, rather than convention, of the divine grace that could transform loss into blessing. His words washed over Eleanor like gentle rain, welcome, but secondary to the simple fact of Daniel beside her, his hand warm and steady in hers, his voice clear and certain as he spoke his vows. "I, Daniel James Hayes, take thee, Eleanor Catherine Morgan, to be my lawfully wedded wife." He recited the traditional words, gaining new meaning through the depth of emotion in his voice. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death us do part." When her turn came, Eleanor's voice trembled only slightly as she made the same promises, each word a stepping stone across the river that had separated her past from her future. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Reverend Wilson declared. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Daniel's kiss was gentle but sure, a public declaration of a private certainty. The congregation's applause seemed distant to Eleanor's ears, less real than the solid warmth of Daniel's hand at her waist, the joyful faces of the twins as they crowded close, the sense of completion that settled over her like a blessing. Outside, the spring sunshine bathed the town in golden light. Well-wishers surrounded them with congratulations and small gifts. Jars of preserves, embroidered linens, a handsome quilt pieced by the women of the congregation in record time. Benjamin Reed was conspicuously absent, having departed Willowbrook the day after the confrontation in the sheriff's office. Rumor had it he had returned to Denver, his engagement to Judge Hargrove's daughter mysteriously terminated. "He'll not trouble you again," Agnes assured Eleanor, at the simple reception held in the church hall. "I made certain his future father-in-law received copies of some particularly illuminating records before he left town." Eleanor didn't ask for details, content to know that the shadow of Benjamin's threats had lifted from her new family's future. The celebration lasted until mid-afternoon, when Daniel finally claimed exhaustion and escorted his new family home, not to Eleanor's cottage or the cabin beneath the pines, but to a new house, halfway between town and the meadows, a wedding gift from the community he had served so faithfully for 5 years. "It needs work," Sheriff Mason had explained apologetically when he presented them with the key. "Been empty since old Jenkins passed last winter, but it's solid built with 4 proper bedrooms and a good kitchen. Room for a doctor's office, too, if you have a mind to make it official." The gesture had moved Daniel to speechlessness, a condition Eleanor had rarely witnessed in him. Now, as they approached the house for the first time as a family, she felt his hand tighten on hers. "Are you happy?" he asked softly. Eleanor looked at him, at this man who had lost so much yet given so freely, who had saved her child's life and ultimately her own, and found no words adequate to express the fullness in her heart. "More than I ever imagined possible," she finally said. The twins ran ahead, racing to be first through the door of their new home, their laughter carrying back on the spring breeze. Daniel and Eleanor followed more slowly, savoring the moment. On the porch, Daniel paused, lifting his hand to touch something above the door that Eleanor hadn't noticed before, a small wooden sign, freshly carved and mounted, bearing the image of 3 birds sheltering 2 smaller ones beneath their wings. "A nest," he explained, seeing her questioning look. "Rose used to say that home isn't a place, but the people who shelter each other through life's storms." "It's perfect," Eleanor said, tracing the careful carving with her fingertips. From inside came the sound of the twins' excited explorations, their voices echoing in the empty rooms that would soon be filled with the comfortable clutter of family life. "Welcome home, Mrs. Hayes," Daniel said, his arms circling her waist. Eleanor leaned into his embrace, the solid warmth of him anchoring her in this new reality, a reality where graves stood empty and lost children found their way home, where broken people could mend each other, where love could emerge from grief like wildflowers after winter's long sleep. "Home," she repeated softly, the word no longer a hope, but a certainty. At last. Together they crossed the threshold, leaving behind the shadows of the past and stepping into the sunlit rooms of their shared future, a future neither of them could have imagined 6 months earlier, when a snowstorm and 2 determined children had brought together souls that had been searching for each other all along. Outside, spring wind rustled through new leaves, carrying away the last whispers of winter. Inside, a family unconventional in its origins, but unshakable in its bonds, began the everyday miracle of building a life together, one small moment of love at a time. A nest in the storm sheltering precious lives. A home at last for hearts too long adrift.